Chapter 19 of the Randolphs by Pansy. Chapter 19 Work that Maria Can Do. Maria Randolph stood in her kitchen, surveying the work spread out there with the air of a general preparing for battle. It was Saturday morning. Washing and ironing were disposed of for the week, and this was the grand day for sweeping, dusting, and mopping, to say nothing of the bread and cookies that must bake with the same fire that cooked the dinner and heated the water for mopping. Economy of forces was rapidly reducing itself to a system in the mind of this young lady. She knew almost to a splinter how many sticks of wood it took to bake 4 loaves of bread and 2 tins of cookies. 5 minutes ago she had work planned to fill the day. Now, with a look of utter perplexity on her face, she twisted a slip of paper over her finger, and wondered what she should do. Finally she opened the bit of paper, and read the brief note again. "Maria, won't you come over here just as quick as you can? Come prepared to stay for a while at least, and help us think what to do. We are in great trouble. Haste, Tom." What in the world does the boy want, I wonder? Why can't he tell me? It would have taken less words, I dare say, than he used in not telling me. That is just like a man. How does he think I can come to stay and leave father? I wonder why Helen wouldn't do. At this point Helen came down the back stairs with a broom and dustpan in hand and an old veil tied over her hair. Maria turned to her. "See here, Helen, what can be the matter?" "I don't know, I am sure," Helen said, reading the note. "You are going to see, aren't you? It must be something serious. He says hurry. Where are your things, Maria?" "How can I go?" said Maria impatiently, who had no intention of not going, but who wanted to be talked into it. "Just look at the things there are to do, and father to be taken care of, and his room put in order." "I'll do the very best I can, and perhaps you won't have to stay long. Anyway, I would go, for poor Tom must be in trouble." Maria turned and bestowed a searching look on her sister. In the midst of her perplexities there intruded this question: "What in the world can have happened to Helen? I wonder if she is going to be sick?" Then she said aloud, "Well, I suppose I must run over and see what is wanted. But I don't see how I can. Anyway, I can't stay." So into the midst of the disorder and consternation that prevailed in the kitchen at the Randolph house came Maria. What a looking place it was! In the great cook stove the fire had utterly died down, the hearth was covered with ashes, and the top of the stove with unwashed cooking utensils, while on every table and shelf appeared the debris of the morning meal. Standing around these scenes of confusion, in various stages of bewilderment, were 3 or 4 girls, looking as though their wits had utterly deserted them, and that they did not know which way to turn. "What in creation is the matter?" queried Maria of Tom, who had evidently just come in, and whose face expressed sorrow and disgust and dismay. "Matter enough," he replied briefly. "See here, Maria," and he opened a door leading into a little room and motioned her to follow. "That girl, you remember," he began as he had carefully closed the door. "What, my friend?" "No, the other, the cook." "Oh, your friend. What about her? Has she deserted? Tom, she hasn't gone to drinking again?" "Yes, she has. She just managed to blunder through the breakfast, and such a breakfast as it was! There wasn't a boarder who could stand a repetition of it. And it seems she has smuggled some liquor into the house, and took some every little while, until now she is in a state of perfect intoxication. Peter and I had to carry her to her room." And Tom's handsome face clouded, and he shivered at the thought. "Such a sight, Maria, I hope you may never have to witness." He paused, seeing that comforting expression, "I told you so," in every line of Maria's face, and he got it too. She was not one to disappoint such expectations. "Tom, what did I tell you? I knew how it would be. And you never did a sillier thing than when you tried to ignore human nature and act as though everybody who had anything to do with the Randolph house was going to be an angel." "I know you told me," Tom said. "It can't in any sense be said to be your fault for not warning me. But I will not pretend penitence. I am not sorry I did it. And, given the same circumstances, I am afraid I would do it again. In fact, I know I should, for I thought I did only what is right. But for all that I am in sore straits, and I don't know which way to turn. The housekeeper is gone for the day, you know, and I can get no extra help. I have been out to 2 intelligence offices without result. Those poor girls out there know no more about what ought to be done in this line than I do myself, though they are good girls, every one of them. I felt as though I must see you for a minute, to advise with you. The house is full of boarders. Shall I call them together, and send them all down to the Clinton house to dinner?" "Nonsense," said Maria, throwing off her shawl on one chair and her hat on another, and some way the tone and the action inspired him with courage. "You will do no such thing. It is a likely story that 4 girls can't get up a dinner of some sort. What are their names, Tom? No, never mind what their names are. You go over to the house and tell Helen to warm father's broth at 11 o'clock, and to see that his feet are warm when he lies down. And give me the keys, and let me know in 10 minutes how many to expect to dinner. I'll look out for all the rest." Tom was amazed and dismayed and relieved, all in one. He had expected no such whirlwind of help as this. He hardly knew what he had expected, except that it seemed natural to think of Maria when he was in trouble. But he utterly distrusted her ability to manage a hotel dinner from the foundation. He began a protest. "But, Maria, I'm afraid you can never—" But she turned abruptly away from him. "I will talk with you after dinner, Tom, if I happen to be alive at that time. It is not talk that we want just now, but work, and we must fly around." Saying which, she opened the little door and went like a fresh young breeze into that dismayed kitchen, leaving Tom standing alone, in doubt whether to be relieved or more perplexed than before. He listened to her brisk voice. "Come, girls, I hear that you and I have got to get the dinner today. We shall have to be brisk, for it is getting late, and our reputation is at stake. We must have a better dinner today than was ever eaten in this house before. Who is the dishwasher? Here, let us all be dishwashers. We can't do anything in such a looking room. What is your name? Kate? Well, Kate, you get the dishpans ready and the hot water, and the rest of you get the dishes in shape. I'll make up the fire and my bill of fare at the same time. Then we'll all set to work at it, and I'll risk us." Tom waited still, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and by that time the kitchen had assumed the look of a campground, with trained soldiers on drill before a masterly general. Every one was busy and alert, the fire was roaring, and Maria was looking out fresh napkins for the dinner table. He turned on his heel with a relieved smile. Some kind of a dinner they would certainly have, and it would appear at the proper time, too. Of that he now felt assured. Punctually at the appointed hour the noisy gong sounded its summons through the halls, and the guests of the Randolph house rushed in from the balconies and down the stairs, eager to obey its voice. Tom had been there before them, and drew a long breath of relief and intense satisfaction as he surveyed the scene. The most faultless cleanliness and order and propriety prevailed. Not a dish was lacking, not a spoon out of place. The silver glittered with new luster, and the glasses sparkled and glowed, while the odor of a delicious coffee floated faintly through the air. That dinner was a triumph. Certain little irregularities that had been frowned over in the morning were utterly forgotten in the perfect satisfaction with which the fastidious guests disposed of their more than usually dainty desserts, and they told each other that there certainly was a most unusual cookery done in that house. It had not been such a formidable thing after all. The startled girls were ready and willing to do, but they had been used to a head to guide them, and when they found Maria capable and determined to be such a head, they fell promptly into line. Also, there came to them a special blessing in the way of desserts. The girl whom Maria had persistently styled her friend, and whom perhaps you remember as paying her a mysterious visit one evening, had been engaged ever since as a chambermaid at the Randolph house. Maria had not as yet had time to cultivate her acquaintance, but persisted in the belief that she was worth cultivating. This girl, in one of her passages through the kitchen, saw the new leader, and instantly recognized her, and as instantly came to her rescue. With a half a dozen skillfully put questions, she gathered the story, and then turned to Maria. "I know how to cook all sorts of fancy things for desserts. If you want my help, my morning's work is nearly done." "Of course we want your help," Maria had answered, quickly, looking relieved. She hated desserts. "Now come down as soon as you can, and get us up the most distracting dish that was ever set on a table. Only remember you will not be allowed to use a drop of wine or brandy for sauce." "I shall not be likely to want to," the girl had answered, with a frown darkening on her face, that had troubled Maria's thoughts since the first time she saw her, and she had turned abruptly away. But she came back in the course of an hour, and rendered such good service that more than one guest at the dinner table wondered where they found such a pastry cook this side of Paris. "No loss without some gain," Maria had quoted to her brother as a conclusion to the story, and after she had explained to him that the trials of the morning had developed a remarkable pastry cook for future use. And he had made her turn away with an almost irritable "Pshaw!" as he had quoted in answer, "All things work together for good." Now the day was nearly done. Maria, at home in the sitting-room, leaning back in the armchair, rocking and resting after the unusual exertions of the day, gave a detailed account of some of the anxieties and mishaps attendant on that exciting preparation for the stomachs of 40 fastidious people. There was a gleam of triumph in her face and voice, and intense satisfaction glowing all through her. If there was any one sin of which this girl was guilty, it was that of jealousy. In her own estimation she had not a touch of it, and certainly her life had proved that she was remarkably unselfish, a thing which very few people are. Still, down in her heart, there had lurked a sore, disappointed feeling about this brother Tom. Had she not been the favorite sister all her life? Had he not told her his plans and hopes and intentions, ever since she was old enough to remember anything? She had been the one to do for him, to think for him, to save for him, to help him in every way that she could imagine, until this last scheme, and this had seemed to come between them. In the first place, it had been her own fault. She had opposed it. But of late she had fallen in with the young man's plans with remarkable patience, and helped him wherever he had asked it. The sore point was that he had rarely asked, and he had asked and received much from Helen. The younger sister understood perfectly the reason for this. She even remembered that he had drawn Helen in, at her own suggestion, and that they had often planned together to interest her for her good. And yet it was new, and it jarred. Helen to receive little notes from Tom, asking her to come over and arrange the parlors for special occasions, to arrange flowers for the rooms of special guests, to play for a rare singer who was stopping with them, to sing with the glee club in the reading room. None of these things could Maria do, and there was a score of other trifles that were shut out from her for the same reason, which made it all the harder. It was well enough when she and Tom together planned ways by which Helen could be told in and made to forget her unhappy self for a little, but gradually Maria knew Helen had become a necessity. She was often sent for, not for her sake, but for Tom's, sent for to fill places that she, Maria, could not fill, and it had hurt. She had called herself a simpleton. She had boasted of her inability to tell what flowers looked well together, or whether the reception chairs should stand at the right or the left of the mirror. Yet in her heart it felt hard to have Helen slipping in where she had been needed so long, and to realize that she was almost never needed at the Randolph house. So on this particular morning she had lifted her eyebrows and spoken sharply to the boy who brought the twisted note. "From Mr. Randolph. He must have told you to give it to Mrs. Munroe. He cannot possibly want anything of me," quoting insensibly words that she had been long used to from Mrs. Munroe's lips. Wasn't it a bit of triumph, then, to discover that at last there was something more important than music and flowers? Something that Helen was as unable to do as the veriest child in the street. Something that if left undone would bring dismay and disaster to the Randolph house. And then to know that she could make it all right, restore order where there was chaos, and, in short, make the wheels of domestic life roll along as smoothly as though the road had not thought of being rough. She was not glad that the poor tempted cook had fallen again, but it was a real delight to find herself a necessity to her brother, to find him turning to her to lean on again, and to know that she was strong enough for the strain. It was largely to this feeling, if the well-satisfied guests had but known it, that they were indebted for the remarkably good dinner that she put forth her wits and her skill to secure for them. So now to-night she rested in her chair and was jubilant. Tom had been ignoring her lately, but he had suddenly found that there were places where she fitted in very nicely. At the particular moment when she was giving this thought expression, in tone rather than in words, Tom opened the door and walked in upon them. "Well," Maria said, "I didn't expect to see the sight of your countenance again to-night. I thought you had seen quite enough of me for one day. What is the matter now? You look as if some new trouble had overtaken you. Didn't the housekeeper come?" "Yes, she came." "Oh, well, then, you will do nicely. That friend of mine is a perfect host in herself. You will do well to promote her. I believe I would give her that miserable cook's place right away." "It isn't that," Tom said, sitting down. "Maria, we seem to be in need of your help a good deal. You are wanted at the Randolph house again, and to-night." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Unequal to the Emergency. "Your friend," Tom continued in answer to his sister's startled and inquiring look, "persists in seeing you to-night, and at once. No one else will do." "What does she want? Is she sick?" "I think not. At least she has been about her work as usual. I think she is sick at heart. In trouble, mental trouble, I am afraid. She came to me a few minutes ago, with so worn and sad a face that it hurt me to look at her, and begged me to let her send a boy for you, as she must see you at once. I tried to discover the trouble, but she seemed unable to tell me, and as I feared you might not understand the message, I judged it best to come myself. Will you go over and see what you can do for her?" Maria arose composedly, and with her intense satisfaction in herself not a whit lessened. "I will go, of course," she said, "though I did suppose I was tired. I expect to find nothing more formidable than a broken pitcher or platter to confess. You contrive to make those girls of yours mortally afraid of you, while they seem very anxious to please you, but I do wish she had left her confession until morning." "It isn't possible that there can be anything so trivial as that. If I thought so, I wouldn't let you go at all. Perhaps it would be as well to send her word that you will come over in the morning, or she may come to you." Maria's only answer was to go in search of hat and shawl, and in a very few minutes to announce herself ready. Arrived at the hotel, she went directly to the room assigned to the girl. That neat little room! Few chambermaids at hotels or elsewhere have such spots to call their own as was that. It had been one of Ermina's blissful whims to have the servants' rooms at the Randolph house furnished with every appliance of convenience and comfort that the needs of respectable girls could suggest. There was even what most mistresses would call luxuries, when they were found in servants' rooms, though these same mistresses have a way of recognizing such articles as common necessities when found elsewhere. It is safe to conclude, Maria thought, glancing complacently around it as she entered, that she never had such comfortable quarters before. Maria enjoyed her having them. She believed in it with all her heart, but she wanted people to be sensible of, and loyal to, the superiority of the Randolph house over the rest of the world. "What can I do for you to-night, Maggie?" she said, trying to speak composedly, for the girl was walking up and down the room, and her eyes looked scarcely less fierce and unreadable than they did on that first meeting with her. She could not be half starved now. What could be the matter with her? "Sit down, please. I have something to tell you," she said in a husky voice, evidently struggling to appear composed and respectful, as became a girl talking to the sister of her employer. Puzzled and half awed by her manner, Maria took the low chair by the stand and waited in silence for her to speak, which she did not seem in haste to do. She renewed her walk through the room, and Maria studied the flushed face and hungry-looking eyes, and tried to determine what could possibly be the matter. "Does it rain?" she asked suddenly. "Yes," Maria said, more astonished than before. "Hard?" "Yes, quite hard." "Such nights drive me wild," Maggie said, and she looked as though she might really be wild. "Because, you see, I don't know where he is, nor that he may not be out in all the storm. It was just on such a night as this that I lost him." "What are you talking about?" said Maria, thoroughly aroused and alarmed. "Sit down, Maggie, and don't walk the floor like an insane woman. I think you must be sick. You would better let me call my brother and send him for a doctor." "I am not sick at all," Maggie said, speaking more quietly, and bringing a chair, she sat down opposite her guest. "I beg your pardon for frightening you, and for sending for you at all. But, Miss Randolph, I had a new thought, a new hope I might almost call it, and it seemed to me that you were the one to help me, and I could not resist sending for you. But first I must tell you something about myself. You think I am insane, and I wonder that I am not. What would you think if I told you that somewhere in this great miserable world I have a little boy, a baby, only 3 years old, wandering up and down in the storm maybe, or lying sick in the gutter, or, I don't know where, dead perhaps. If I could only know that he was, how happy I could be. What do you think of a trouble like that?" "Do you really mean it?" Maria said, horror and pain in her voice. "Maggie, what can you mean? And how could such a thing be?" Maggie laughed a laugh that had no sweetness in it. "You may as well ask," she said, "and you are dying to ask me 100 questions. Why didn't I take care of my boy, if I had one, and not let him get lost? Oh, only God knows how I tried. My darling, I did everything, and bore everything for you, and what did it amount to? It isn't a long story, Miss Randolph, to those who are familiar with such things. I could tell you it in one word. It was rum that stole my baby and lost him, and I have been without him for 2 dreadful years. Now you know it all." "But how?" repeated Maria, her face pale with sympathy and dismay. "Tell me about it. How could it be, and what have you done?" "Done? I've done everything. No, I thought of one thing I have not done, and I have sent for you to-night to help me do that. His father took him from his warm little crib out into the night and storm. Think of that! And he was sick, too. I had run to the doctor's next door for some medicine for him, and when I came back he was gone, and I have never seen nor heard of him since. And don't you wonder that my reason has not gone? But it will not. I will keep that, and I will find him yet. I will never give it up, never." Maria sat as one stunned. What a strange, terrible story to whirl right into the midst of her quiet, uneventful life. How could such sorrow as that be possible? She began after a little to pour out questions, and Maggie, who seemed to have grown calmer in the telling of her bitterness, answered briefly and promptly every one. Her husband had been a post-office clerk in a neighboring city. They had been very happy once. He only took a spoonful of medicated wine to strengthen him after night work, when he had to sit late making up the books. The doctor had ordered it; said, indeed, that he would break down without it. "I hate doctors," Maggie said, flashing into a sudden fire, then quieting at once and going on with her story. Little by little the habit grew, until he was very often exhausted, and the wine was soon used without any medication, and it ceased to strengthen him, and something stronger was obtained, and, oh me! Maria had heard the whole story dozens of times. There wasn't a new feature about it. It was that which is being worked out with every day's history, only it had never come to one with whom she could sit and talk till she could not only know, but feel the sorrow. There is a great difference between the two. Helen's tragedy had been cut off in its early days by death. It might have been as terrible as this. It took an hour to tell the story in all its pitifulness, how the drunken father had come just as she ran out. She saw him come and felt no fear, for in his wildest moments he had never been other than loving to the boy. She saw him go out again with a bundle in his arms, and wondered what had been sacrificed now, and hastened home to see, and she found an empty crib. Footnote: founded on fact. The incident came within my own knowledge. Pansy. End footnote. What had been the father's object, where he went, or what he did, or why he did it, the poor half-wild mother did not know, and could never conjecture. She knew only too well that from that day forth she had seen neither husband nor baby, nor had any trace of them ever come to her, though she had used all ways and means that keen brains and determined wills could devise. Before the story was concluded, the poor mother had talked herself into calmness. "I was on the very verge of insanity that evening when I came to you," she said quietly. "I can never tell any one the story of my wanderings, nor of the cruel things that were said to me. I used to look at happy mothers with their darlings in their arms, and think, if you knew, I wonder what you would say." "Why didn't you tell them and see?" "Once I did," she answered, with a flash in her eyes that told of smothered fire. "And the woman said, 'The miserable creature is not only intoxicated but crazy. She ought to be taken to the madhouse.' But don't let me talk of it. I can't. There is one thing I have never done. I did not even think of it until this morning, when your brother was praying at family prayers, you know. I have never prayed for him. I do not mean that I have not gone down on my knees and cried out wildly to God to give him back to me, but that is not the kind of prayer that I mean. My prayers are not acceptable to God. I am not a Christian woman. I never have been, but I mean to be. I want to know now how to be a Christian, so that I can go to God and pray for my baby, and feel sure that he hears, and trust him, just as your brother does. I must learn to pray. I did not know who to ask. I cannot talk to a man and tell him my bitter story, but to-day, when I worked with you, and saw how efficient you were, and how prompt to do just the right thing at the right time, it flashed upon me how much I would give to hear you pray to God for my darling, and then I thought you were just the one to help me learn to pray for him myself, and I thought about it, and kept going back to it, until I felt to-night that I had got to see you. Now, will you help me?" Imagine, if you can, how Maria Randolph felt. She had come over there with an assured feeling that, whatever was asked of her, she was equal to the occasion. A sense of superiority, a sense of power, had possessed her all day, and grown upon her with each added call. Yet here she was, asked to pray. Not only that, but asked to show another how to pray. She, who had never prayed in her life! What could she do or say? Here was this miserable mother devouring her with hungry eyes, and with a hope so eager and strong springing up in her poor heart, that it seemed a solemn thing to crush it. Why had she not asked Tom? How gladly he would have prayed and pointed out the way to her. Still Maggie waited for the answer. Something must be said. Must she make the humiliating confession? "You have come to the wrong one," she said at last, speaking desperately. "I don't know how to pray for myself. I never prayed in my life." What a monstrous admission for a sane woman to make! Maria felt it as she spoke the words. "Yes, I used to pray at my mother's knee, but I don't know how now. Why didn't you ask my brother? If there is any one in the world who knows how to pray, it is he, and you would find him one to sympathize with you in your trouble, as few people can." Maggie had left her chair, and was walking the floor again. "I felt as if I needed a woman to speak to," she said. "I felt sure that you could help me. I thought you were just the one, and you had been so kind to me, kind when everyone else was cruel. I am sorry I troubled you. I should not have sent for you, I suppose, but I felt so sure. I am awfully disappointed." "Let me call my brother," Maria said, moving toward the door, speaking in a low, subdued voice. She felt utterly humiliated. "No," Maggie said, "not now, please. I could not explain. I cannot talk about it any more. It would do no good either. What good can praying do? You don't believe in it, do you?" "Yes, I do, with all my heart. I had a mother who prayed, and I have a father whom I know God hears and answers. Yes, if there is anything in the world I have unshaken faith in, it is prayer." "Then why don't you pray?" Now, what was a sensible person to answer to such a question as that, in the face of such a declaration as she had just made, and upon which she had prided herself? Maria felt the force of her own folly, and was puzzled and embarrassed. There really seemed to be nothing to say. Being one who was not accustomed to answer with silence, she said the only thing left to her under the circumstances. "I don't know, I am sure." Maggie regarded her fixedly, and something very like a smile hovered about the corners of her drawn mouth. Could it be a derisive smile? "I think I was mistaken in you," she said simply. "I imagined you were like your brother, only with a certain natural force that drew me, made me feel like resting on you. I thought perhaps you were very high in favor with God." What a strange sentence! It sent a thrill like an electric shot through Maria's sensitive nerves. She was fond of power. She delighted in being leaned upon. She enjoyed reflected greatness. She liked being Tom Randolph's sister and Mr. Harper's sister-in-law. What a thing it would be to be high in favor with God! To be so familiar at court that she could present a friend there, as she had been asked to do this evening, without a fear or doubt as to the result. Yet what a broken reed she had been! She felt a bitter, utterly new sense of humiliation. There came a low, quick knock at the door, and Tom's voice outside. "Maria, will you stop with us all night? If so, I will go over and tell father. I am afraid they will be anxious." "No," Maria said, rising suddenly. "I can't stay. I am coming now. Maggie, let me ask my brother to come in. He can help you." "It would not be a suitable thing to do," Maggie said quietly, and there was that strange smile on her face. "Don't you know the world would be shocked at such an indecorous proceeding? You see I am shut up to your help to-night or none." How true it was! Tom could not come in there at that hour, even to pray, with a young and beautiful woman. "Then go to God," Maria said, suddenly and with intense energy. "I am sorry I cannot help you, but because I have shown myself a fool, you need not be one. Go right to him. I know my Father's God will hear you and help you." "What a long conference," Tom said, when his sister came out to him. "It couldn't have been about a picture. What did she want, if I may be told?" "She wanted me to pray with her." Maria's voice was abrupt and hard. Tom was very much startled. "And did you?" he asked after a few minutes of silence, during which it appeared that she had no more to tell him. "What a foolish question!" she said bitterly. "Whatever else I may be, I am not a hypocrite." He was still until they were crossing the road. Then he said, "What do you think of your ability to follow out the orders of your motto now? It cannot be possible that you think when a waiting soul asks you to pray, Christ does not say to you, do it." She answered not a word, but it was a new sting. She had forgotten her motto, "Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it." She had boasted of her ability to follow it. Had she? She went into the house and up to her room in utter humiliation. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of the Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Waiting for Something to Happen. Life now began to take a very humdrum aspect to Maria Randolph, and if there was any one aspect of life above another that was hateful to her, it was humdrumness. Real, tangible trouble was almost more endurable. She dreaded the winter. It stretched before her in interminable stupidity. She grumbled over the prospect to Tom one morning. "I know just exactly what will happen to-morrow, just as well as I do what is going on to-day, and the day after to-morrow will be the same. Helen is gloomy or sharp all the time, and father sick in his room, and you at that tiresome house that swallows all your strength and all your heart, and Grace gone. The prospect is dismal, now isn't it? I don't fret very often, do I? But it does seem to me as if life was very forlorn. I like to have things happen, even if they are troublesome to manage. My washing is really the only excitement I have, and there isn't enough of that to keep me busy, though Dick Norton does get his clothes horribly dirty, and he contrives to tear them every week, just for the pleasure of seeing me mend them, I verily believe." "How does his education progress?" Tom asked. "I thought you were fitting him for college?" "Now, Tom Randolph, you are not to make fun of him. He is doing real well, poor fellow. If he were 10 or 20 years younger, and had a chance, he would make a scholar yet. He can read chapters in the Bible now without stumbling at all, and he is just as interested as possible." "I am glad of it," Tom said, laughing, "though it seems to me there are important ifs in the way of his becoming a scholar. But, Maria, don't you think Helen improves? She is less gloomy than she used to be, isn't she?" "Why, she is different," Maria said thoughtfully, as if the idea had just been suggested to her. "Yes, there is a difference. She is preoccupied, seems to have very little time to devote to me or to fault-finding either. Now I think of it, I have been struck with her silence several times when I expected an outburst. But she always impresses me with the idea that she has forgotten to say anything, rather than that she didn't intend to. What interests her so much over at the Randolph house? She spends a great deal of her time there." "She is interested in everything that pertains to it," Tom said heartily, "and she is a real help to us. I think she is very different. I wouldn't worry about the winter, Maria. Enough things may happen, things that you do not want, perhaps." "Don't croak," said Maria impatiently. "What could happen? Father is better, every one thinks so. I can see that he is improving every day. If we had a doctor who knew anything, I believe he would get real well. Mr. Harper thinks he gains." "I think so myself," Tom said, with heartiness enough to comfort Maria, whose irritation arose from an excessive desire to make every one confess that her father was at least not growing worse. "But you have certainly a care in looking to his comfort, and I know it must be a pleasure." "Of course," she said in her practical way. "But the thing is, what to do with myself when I have done everything for him that I possibly can, and more too. When the work is all done, there is only a little handful of work now, and when I am alone, it is very easy for you to preach contentment, but I am not content. I wasn't made to be, I don't believe, unless my hands were so full that I didn't know what to do first. I tell you I am restless, and I can't help it." Tom looked at her wistfully. "It seems strange," he said, "to hear you complaining of not enough to do, when there is so much work waiting to be done. Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. Think what a very broad command that is." "Don't preach," said Maria, and she turned away from him impatiently again. But his words seemed to have suggested to her a new train of thought. She turned back presently with a question. "Tom, what did you do with that girl? I left her in a forlorn state, and when I met her yesterday, she smiled and bowed and looked as sunshiny as though she had found her baby. Isn't that perfectly horrible, anyway? I would find him. If I were she, I would travel through the whole world night and day until I got him again." "You would do much better to earn your living and something over, to help prosecute the search intelligently and with system, as she is doing." Tom spoke so quietly that Maria's blaze of enthusiasm died down. "What did you do for her?" she asked, speaking more quietly. "Sent Kate up to her. She spent the night, and in the morning she told me that Maggie had gone to the only one who could possibly help her much, and given her cause into his hands. She feels surer of success now than she ever did." Now Kate was the Scotch-Irish waiter at the Randolph house, a red-cheeked, broad-shouldered maid-of-all-work, with a certain native refinement of speech and manner that seemed to belong to her heart more than her education. And so in truth it did. She was being educated into the delicacy and tenderness of Christian fellowship. Maria had heard her brother speak of her before as an earnest Christian girl, whose influence was very strong for good. But what a humiliating discovery that where she utterly failed, Kate, with her disregard for the King's English, who said him and her, and even his'n and your'n, with perfect indifference, should have been able to afford signal and efficient help. This fact was a perfect irritation to Maria. It was so hard to be recognized as a failure. "I am glad you have such a perfect treasure as Kate in your family," she said, speaking contemptuously, answering what she had heard him say before, rather than anything which he had said then. "I should think you would set her at the work of reforming that precious cook of yours, who will burn the house down over your head one of these nights. If she is such a powerful agent for good, you ought to try what she can do in that direction." "I have," Tom said, still speaking with the utmost quiet and patience. "She is doing better than you propose. She is trying to help her to look to the only one who can give her strength to reform. And we are all praying that she may be helped to look. You should have heard Maggie pray for her last evening in the girls' meeting. Kate said it made them all cry." "What a melting time!" Maria said, with scoffing voice and a sore heart. Maggie had learned to pray, and she had not helped her in that, nor in anything, and she had felt such an interest in her, such a burning desire to help her in her great sorrow. Tom looked at his young sister with a pitying sigh. "You need a place to rest, Maria," he said tenderly. "Why will you not come to it?" Maria rallied her pride, and turned to him with a laugh. "I need a scolding," she said cheerily, "for being so cross. Do me the credit of remembering that I am not often such a dragon as I have shown myself this morning. I hope you will all get just as good over there as you can, and then come here and take me over. I realize that I need it. I'm sure, Tom, who in the world is this standing at the door with Helen?" They were near the side window, and the piazza door was plainly discernible from where they stood. Tom looked. "Don't you know him?" he said. "I thought you had met him. He is a good man. Why, he is a home missionary. Been 2 or 3 years in southern Michigan, and is going back in 2 months or so. He has been sent on here to collect funds toward helping forward their church building. Didn't you hear him in our church one Sunday? Oh, I remember, you stayed with father that morning. Well, he gave us a good sermon. I know you didn't hear him now, for I remember wishing you had let Helen stay with father, and had come to church. I thought it was a sermon which would have helped you." "About home missions?" said Maria. "Do you think I would make a good missionary, Tom?" And she laughed gleefully. "It wasn't on that subject," said Tom, thoughtfully. "At least, only incidentally. It was on the need of personal consecration." "Well, in the meantime, what is he doing on the piazza talking with Helen?" "Why, I suppose he met her on the street and walked down with her. He said to me he would like to call on father sometime, if he was able to see him. He met some men in Michigan whom father once helped, and who were very grateful. He said it might be pleasant to father to hear the story from him. Perhaps that is his present errand." "He won't see father this morning," Maria said positively, "unless his business is much more urgent than that. I have been giving his room a tremendous clearing up, and he is tired out. Tom, come over to tea to-night. We are going to have flapjacks, and you know you are too fashionable to have them at the Randolph house. So come here where you can enjoy them. He is coming in, I declare!" And Maria suddenly vanished up the back stairs. Now I want to take you back for perhaps 2 months, and explain to you certain items of which Maria was in ignorance. It was Sunday morning, one of Helen Munroe's miserable days. I hardly know why it was that Sunday seemed to be her worst day, but you will often find it so among people to whom that day ought to be a blessing. She had spent the morning in a miserable state of doubt, whether to drag herself to church or to stay at home. If she could have stayed in her own room, and spent her time on the bed, half sleeping, half crying, and wholly miserable, she would not have hesitated a moment. But the consciousness that she would have either to go to church or to spend the time in or near her father's room made her undecided. He was very particular that the family should be represented at church, and the effort to invent an excuse for not going, and at the same time for not giving Maria a chance to go, would have involved more energy than she possessed. So, after delaying until it was almost too late for anyone to go, she decided that a morning church would be preferable to a morning under the possible questionings of her father. So she went. A stranger preached, a common, uninteresting-looking stranger. So she called him the moment her eye rested on him. As for him, something perhaps in the wan, pale face, shrouded behind the widow's weeds, looking at him presently with earnest, haunting eyes, may have attracted him to turn often during his more pointed sentences to the Randolph pew. There were many pointed sentences in his sermon. The text, in the first place, was startling, at least it startled Helen. She could not remember ever having heard the words before, "When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed." The subject, of course, from such a text was unpaid vows. I do not know that there was anything particularly new in that sermon. I know the man was not specially eloquent. In fact, Helen Munroe listened, or sat in the seat and pretended to listen, every Sabbath of her life to sermons that had 5 times the rhetoric and talent shown in them that this one possessed. I do not know what it was, except that the man was solemnly, I might almost say tremendously, in earnest. Also, I suppose the Spirit of God had a message that day for just that woman sitting in the Randolph pew, and he chose the stranger preacher to deliver it. Perhaps the reason for that might have been that the stranger had that very morning spent an hour on his knees, making the bold petition that God would honor his work to some special soul, and do it that very day. At least all of these things occurred, and who shall be able to say that they were not connected, each with the other? Helen Munroe had never heard such solemn truth as came home to her conscience that morning. Yes, she had vowed. She remembered the summer morning long ago in which she had stood in that very church and taken the solemn vows of its covenant upon her, while the gentle little mother down in that pew where she sat now brushed sweet and grateful tears from her flushed cheeks, and her father looked his gladness and his love from eyes that were dim with excess of feeling. The scene was very vivid. It had made a strong impression on her at the time, and she could recall some of the very language of the covenant. Now, as to payment, had she deferred? For a long time, in fact for years, Helen Munroe had had a dim, uncomfortable sense in her heart that her religion was a very weak and worthless type. She had felt a sort of contempt for her own profession, even when she strenuously clung to it as though there was that in it that some way made life a little more safe for her. But I do not think that she had ever stood face to face with her heart and felt it laid bare of all hiding places and subterfuges until that morning. Some way those simple, plain words of the preacher seemed to scald her. She passed through many phases of feeling during that half hour. At first she was interested, then shocked, then angry, then alarmed, then utterly, and, as she felt, hopelessly miserable. It was pitiful to see how she clung to her poor little rag that she had called religion, and felt as though if she should actually let go and say, "I am not a Christian," it would be a settled doom to her. And yet, as the searching work went on, how could it be that she knew anything experimentally about this matter to have lived the life she had? When the service closed, she was conscious of but one strong desire, to get away from everybody, to get to her room, to lock her door, to have a chance to be utterly miserable. And I have no doubt she would have carried out that design. She had decided, before the sermon's close, that it was not possible that she could ever have any right to take the vows of the church upon her, and that having a name to live was of small comfort after all. She would give it all up. She would never come to the communion again. She would stop going to prayer meeting (she still went occasionally). She would not be a hypocrite, whatever else she might be. But this resolve did little toward quieting the tumult in her heart. For, after all, it was toward no such resolve that the preacher or the text was aiming. "Pay that which thou hast vowed," were the concluding words of the text, and she was not allowed to lose sight of them. Tom came over to her the instant the benediction was pronounced. "Won't you go over to the house with me?" he said, and he looked anxious. "I have some strangers there for the Sabbath, and they talk all sorts when they get in the parlors, unless there is something to entertain them. Will you just go over and give us some music?" It was the very last thing that it seemed to Helen she could do, and she was ready with a decided negative. But she had been accommodating of late, and Tom seemed to expect it, and did not wait for a negative. He turned to greet the preacher. "Good morning. Mr. Leonard, let me introduce my sister. Helen, will you walk along with Mr. Leonard? He is to dine with us, and I have to go to my class, you know." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Home Missions. And there was Helen standing in the aisle, calmly waited for by the minister, while the unsuspecting brother hurried away, supposing he had arranged matters very satisfactorily. There was no recourse but to lead the way to the Randolph house with what grace she could, and Helen walked on before, feeling that this thing was sorely against her will for more reasons than one. The clergyman was not a difficult person to entertain. Indeed, from the first, he was unlike any one she had ever seen. His first opening of conversation was strikingly unlike what she expected. He made no remark on the weather, or the beauty of the elegant church which they had just left. Instead, he said, suddenly, as one absorbed in the thought, and imagining that all others were equally interested, "That was a remarkable text I preached from this morning, wasn't it? I don't know when any verse of the Bible has come to me with such force. Unpaid vows! Only think of it! Isn't it startling when we remember to whom they are due?" "Very," Helen said, and something in her voice caused him to turn his eyes from space and look searchingly at her. "Who does pay them?" she asked, bridling suddenly, as if he had accused her of unfaithfulness, and speaking almost fiercely. "I am sure I don't know of any one who lives up to his profession in the sense that you talked about this morning." His answer, if answer it could be called, was certainly very peculiar. "Don't you know one who is trying to?" The emphasis on the word "one" was very marked. There was no escaping the fact that he meant her to understand that she, herself, was the one meant. "No," she said, speaking as before, with a sharpness that was almost fierce. "Do you mean that you have never made any vows?" No, she could not say that. It would not be true. She had too recently gone over that day, when the solemn public vows were taken, to be able to ignore them now. Her answer was less sharp, but it was distinct. "Yes, I have vowed." "Then you cannot mean that you are not trying." There was consternation in his voice, not feigned, but real genuine dismay. To this honest man it was evidently no light thing to promise and not perform, even when the one promised was the Lord himself. It is a strange thing, but how can we help believing it to be actually the case, that people who would be shocked at the idea of violating their word given to their fellow men, yet seem to ignore, without much trouble of conscience, the most solemn obligations made to God? The actual enormity of this proceeding had never struck to Helen's conscience so forcibly as it did at the moment when that probing question was put. Natures constituted like hers are rarely stirred deeply without becoming, or seeming to become, very irritable. She answered in great heat and haste. "Yes, I mean just that. I don't think I have tried at all, not for this long time. I doubt whether I ever really tried. I was led into a public profession, as many another person has been, when I did not know what I was about, and much good I have ever done the church. I am in a false position. I never realized it as I have done today. Your sermon has accomplished so much. Perhaps you can tell me how to get out of it. Does the church release people from its role? How shall I manage? I have no desire to be where I do not belong." "I know of but one way," he said. His voice had lost its excited, astonished tone, and was quiet and firm. "I know of but one honorable way. Pay that which thou hast vowed. It is the command of God himself. It seems to be the way he has chosen for helping people who are in trouble, and who are sincerely desirous of getting out. I know there is such talk as release from the church roll, as though the vows were all made to the church instead of the church being only a witness. I know people think they are doing a very honorable thing to stay away from the communion when they feel that they have not lived a right sort of life. But only see how foolish it is. If you had made your brother a promise, and had called on me to witness to it, and had broken that promise again and again, would it make matters all right for you to refuse to have anything to do with me, the witness?" This was the beginning of it. The Randolph house was some distance away, and the talk continued. It continued after they went to the parlor, and though Helen broke away from it for a time, after dinner, when she came down to play, after the music was over, chance led her to the seat near the clergyman, and some sentence that seemed to her to be a chance one led them back into the very topic again. That was weeks ago. Much had transpired since then. The home missionary still lingered in the city, taking trips constantly to other cities and towns, but making the Randolph house his headquarters by the eager invitation of the host. Tom felt the influence of such guests in the house. Helen saw much of this guest, heard much from him, chiefly at first on this, to him, absorbing subject, personal and entire consecration. Gradually, almost imperceptibly to herself, her ideas and feelings began to change. I do not know, and I am not sure that she knows herself, whether during all those past years of church membership she was a Christian or not. She vexed her soul over the weary question for long days, but she had finally to give it up as, after all, of minor importance, compared with the vital one waiting to be answered. She came finally to understand that the point was not, was I a Christian last year, or last week, or even yesterday? But, do I mean to be one today, now? When at last she was able to rest her heart on that one question, she began to feel that there was such a thing as solid rock, and that she must have it for a foundation. There was no sudden experience of light and brightness. Instead, the way was obscured for a good while. She had had much light given her heretofore, and had chosen to go veiled, refusing to receive it. Why should it come in floods of glory to her now? But, after all, there came to be a sense of peace, of security, of humility, and yet of assurance. She walked softly, as one almost in a dream, as one who feared a rude awakening. She worked softly, so softly that she herself hardly realized that she was working at all. But she realized that she was looking for work and wanted to do it, and such people are generally at faithful work, though they may not know it. Maria had felt the change and wondered over it, and feared at times that Helen was going to be very sick. That is as far as she reached in understanding the secret. I am not sure but sickness was the only power she recognized as a subduing agency. Among other things about her sister that she did not know, it so happened that she had never met and never heard of this man whose sermon had been the instrument used to set these new experiences in motion. We left him, you may remember, standing with Helen on the side piazza, or rather they were just about to enter as Maria vanished upstairs. She was gone just long enough to brush over her somewhat ruffled hair, exchange a somewhat soiled kitchen apron for a fresh one of the same fashion, and then she descended. It would have been too great a concession to the manners and customs of the silly world to have left that kitchen apron hanging in its place and gone down without one, though she had no special use for such an article for some time to come. But this girl was so sensible that any such foolish concession to the pride of other people was not to be thought of. There are a great many such sensible people in the world, and the world does not love them at all, and half of the time it is their own foolish fault for being so "cranky" over trifles. So down came Maria in a big dark calico apron which nearly covered her up. Her action lost half of its martyr element this time, for the two people standing in the little sitting room both looked and acted as though they did not know whether her apron was of silk or tow cloth. "Maria," Helen said, turning to her the moment the door opened, and there was a flush on her cheek deeper than usual, "let me introduce you to the Reverend Mr. Leonard. My sister Maria, Mr. Leonard." "How do you do?" asked the reverend gentleman, and his voice was genial and hearty, and he shook her hand in an altogether unconventional manner. "I have heard of this sister several times in the course of the last few weeks. How is your father to-day? Do you mean to let me have a little bit of a talk with him, or don't you think it would be prudent? They tell me you watch over his comfort with a forethought and carefulness that are wonderful." Then he helped himself to a seat, and continued talking about her father, asking questions as to his sickness and the remedies in use and their effect, with such interest and with evidently so thorough an understanding of sickness, and such a common-sense view of its needs, that Maria felt her stiff dignity, which she had put on to greet a stranger and a minister, thawing rapidly. She surprised herself by the detail with which she entered into a description of her father's state, and became deeply interested in Mr. Leonard's suggestion as to certain strength-giving potions. Helen, meantime, seemed suddenly to have lost the grace and ease for which she had always been remarkable in the entertainment of strangers, and was silent and flushed. Maria could not tell what to think of her. Presently the question of a call on the father came up again, and Maria was sufficiently thawed to admit, graciously, that when he awoke, if he felt as well as usual, she knew of no reason why he would not like to see Mr. Leonard for a few minutes. "I should imagine, from some things you have said, that you have seen a sick man before, and have a little common sense left as to what weakness is able to bear, which is more than can be said of the majority of people who come to call on him." This sentence, uttered in a half-savage tone, was as nearly a compliment as any that Maria had ever spoken. It ended in her going to the sick-room, and returning presently with the gracious permission to make a 10 minutes' call, or, if her father did not seem tired, 15 minutes. No, it did not end in that way. Mr. Leonard had risen, and was moving toward the bedroom door, when he suddenly turned, and said, thoughtfully, "Perhaps this is hardly the right thing after all, Helen. I think we can be wiser than this." "What on earth does the man mean?" was Maria's mental comment. Then he turned to her. "The truth is, my friend, I shall have to make a confidant of you. I am very willing to do so, I am sure, and it seems to be the prudent way. Do you think your father sufficiently strong this morning for an important conversation? I am going home in another month, and I want to take your sister Helen with me. Do you think I may ask him for such a favor, or ought I to wait until a more favorable time?" Now, of all the experiences of Maria's life, and some of them had been startling enough, nothing had ever so amazed her. She stood still, with her hand on the knob of her father's door, and looked from one to the other of the two people standing near her, with a face in which astonishment and incredulity curiously blended. Helen's face flushed crimson before the look, the flush running up to her very hair. She could realize, in a measure, what this surprise was to Maria. As for Mr. Leonard, he laughed good-naturedly. "What do you mean?" Maria asked at last. "Where is your home, if you will be so kind as to state? And what can you possibly want of Helen? She is not strong enough for a teacher, and besides, it would be a dreadful life for her. I should hate to have her a martyr to that extent." There was a tremulousness in her voice, and an evident desire to shield Helen, that strangely moved that older sister. Someway, she felt then, as she never had before, what a caretaking, burden-bearing life Maria led, and was willing to lead, for them all. Mr. Leonard seemed to appreciate it. He spoke quickly and with feeling. "I will shield her in every way in my power. Her life shall not be harder than I can help. And as for the trials and privations, I think she is ready for them, and willing to bear the burden. My home is in southern Michigan, and she will have but one scholar. As her husband, I think I can make the work easier for her than if she went out alone. I am a home missionary, you know." Still Maria stood looking at them, the surprise in no way lessening, the incredulous look deepening, if anything. It was becoming very embarrassing, at least to Helen, until suddenly Maria ejaculated 3 words, so full of pent-up astonishment that they bristled with exclamation points. "Helen Munro, a missionary!" They had the effect of producing a reaction on Helen's excited nerves. She had been on the verge of tears. Now she laughed. Dropping into the nearest chair, she covered her glowing face with her hands and shook with laughter, in which Mr. Leonard seemed to feel moved to join with great apparent satisfaction. In the midst of this, Mr. Randolph's voice was heard calling Maria. She escaped into his room, and when, a few minutes thereafter, she emerged, propriety had returned to the two in the sitting-room, and they were sitting in decorous quiet waiting for a chance to make that call. "Go on, Helen," said Maria, leaving the door ajar and motioning them in. She seemed to have determined that it was Helen's place to introduce the stranger. And Helen, followed by Mr. Leonard, went softly into the quiet room, and Maria herself shut the door after them with a little nervous click and a curious sensation in her throat. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Once and Again. Maria walked to that side window out of which she and Tom had looked but a few minutes before, and it seemed to her that the world must have changed a good deal in that time, such a surprise had come into her life. There remained that queer feeling in her throat, as of one who was choking back tears, though why should she cry? She heard the steady murmur of voices in the bedroom. It was an earnest conference. She had doubted the wisdom of exciting her father with such an astounding revelation. She had even taken time to wonder what Grace would say to their consistency when her poor little affair had to be so carefully guarded from troubling him. But there was nothing else that it seemed possible to do. This was altogether different from two simpletons like Grace and Alfred Parks playing at grown-upness. These were man and woman, each with years and dignity enough to decide questions for themselves. Having decided, it was the Father's blessing that they sought now. Maria could not doubt that they would get it. She knew that it would be a joy to her father's heart to have the family represented in such work as the home mission cause afforded. But what a queer representative! This thought almost caused a reaction. It certainly had its ludicrous side to think of Helen Munroe in such a position. Tom came somewhat hurriedly across the street and entered the side door. "Why, I thought Mr. Leonard was here," he said, looking about him in surprise. "He is," said Maria, briefly, and she nodded her head toward the bedroom. "A private conference, Tom." "Ah," he said, "I expected that." "One would have supposed you might have given me a slight hint, then, at least of the existence of such a person," and Maria looked dignified. "My dear Maria, there was nothing for me to hint. I was just suspicious without having any reasonable ground for being so. I had a presentiment, perhaps some would call it, but it wouldn't have looked well for me to have told you so. I wonder when the conference will be ended. I am not sure but I ought to intrude. There is a man waiting to see Mr. Leonard, and the business is urgent." "Tom, isn't it the queerest thing that ever happened?" "What, this? I think it is the best thing that has happened to the Randolph family yet." Whereupon Tom crossed to the bedroom door, and without further ceremony knocked. A half-dozen words exchanged with Mr. Leonard, and that gentleman made hurried adieus, and left in his company. Helen lingered a little with her father, the door still shut. When she came out, there were traces of tears on her face, but her eyes were smiling. Maria seemed glued to that window-seat. Helen went over to her. "Were you very much surprised?" she asked, speaking gently. "Surprise is no name for it. I don't think I would have been much more bewildered if he had come after me." Helen laughed. "In many respects it would have been a much better thing for him to do," she said. "But, for the comfort of the entire Randolph family, we rejoice that he did not." "Why? It does not follow that I would have rushed out there after a home missionary life at the first opportunity. I don't think I am fitted for such a place; and, for the matter of that, I don't think you are." Now the Helen of Maria's acquaintance heretofore would have bridled at this, and strongly hinted that she, Maria, was not the proper person to judge of one's fitness for places, and that it made very little difference to any one what she thought. Maria knew this, and expected something in that line; but she felt most unusually severe, in proportion as her heart had been touched, and trembled under the shadow of coming changes, did her resolute will resist this invasion of feeling, and resort to positive roughness to hide its softness. Helen remained beside her keeping silence for 2 or 3 minutes, then she said, "I do not wonder at that remark, Maria. I have been at work all my life, proving to you my unfitness for any place of trust. No one certainly can feel less qualified than I in many respects feel myself to be. But there is one thing which I ought to tell you. In some degree I am different from what I was a few weeks ago. I hardly know what to call it. I do not try to name it, but for the first time in my life I am sure I love the Lord Jesus Christ, and I long to show my love by anything that I can do. I did not seek for this thing, I did not hope for it, I did not dream of it. I simply prayed to be shown the way in which to walk, to be led as a child, and God seemed to send to me this answer. How much I thank him for such an answer I cannot explain even to you." And then this reserved, oftentimes haughty woman stooped and kissed her youngest sister as she stood there, sticking a pin as far into the window-seat as it could be forced to go. Then she went away upstairs to the privacy of her own room, and Maria stood still and worked at that pin. The excitement in no wise lessened, the bewilderment greatly deepened by this latest development. Only this feeling was strong and clear in the midst of all the whirl of conflicting and excited thought: "There is a power beyond anything that has ever touched my life, beyond anything that I have ever imagined." The power that could make Helen Munroe acknowledge anything that should be humbling to her pride was a power that her sister Maria did not understand, and that she felt compelled to respect. After she had buried that pin in the wood so deeply that no amount of digging could bring it out, she set about getting dinner as usual. Yet it was not as usual. The shadow of a surprising change had fallen over the family. She felt it, and could not rid herself of it, even as she walked to and fro in that room, looking in every respect as it had looked for so long. The something which she had craved, no matter what, but an hour before, had come to her with a vengeance. There was no more need to mourn over not enough to do. The new plans brought a great influx of work, and not only work, but responsibility. A dozen times a day during the next few weeks did Maria have occasion to contrast the lives of the two persons, Helen Randolph and Helen Monroe, under like circumstances, and be filled with amazement over the latter. "Helen," she said, "aren't you going to get a new silk?" "Dear me, no. How could I? And what should I need of one if I could? I'm going to live in a log cabin for the next few years." "But what will you be married in?" "Oh, why, my traveling dress." "What is that to be?" "I don't know, I am sure. I haven't thought. Alpaca of some sort, I guess, or empress cloth." "Alpaca!" And Maria stood aghast. How would Helen Randolph have looked in an alpaca? It really became bewildering as a new experience. She had to learn how to fight Helen to have things, instead of combating her expensive tastes. This seemed the more strange, since Ermina, in her long, long letter of congratulation, had enclosed a bank check as a wedding gift that stood for any amount of finery, and hinted that such was its intended use. Helen and Maria had changed places. Maria was intent on sustaining the Randolph honor, and Helen was engaged in saying, "What's the use? I really shall not need anything of the kind." The same bewilderments occurred over the wedding arrangements. "Where will we set the table?" Maria said. "In the back parlor, or just leave it in the dining room?" "When?" "When? Why, when the day comes. Helen, what is the matter with you?" "Well," says Helen, laughing, "I should say, let's have breakfast in the dining room, just as usual." "And what shall we have?" "Oh, I don't know, beefsteak and griddle cakes, I guess. I must learn how to make your kind of griddle cakes. Mr. Leonard says they are better than Westerners get." "Helen Monroe!" Maria exclaims, and she drops the skirt she is basting, and looks the picture of despair. "Who ever heard of beefsteak and griddle cakes for a wedding breakfast?" "Oh, a wedding breakfast," repeats Helen, as if that were an entirely new idea. "Why, Maria, it need not be different from any other breakfast that I see. Tom will be the only one besides the Harpers." "Don't you mean to have any company at all?" "Oh, dear, no. Whom could I have? Father is too feeble for company, you know. Besides, I really don't think of anybody that I want. I'll tell you, Maria, fix it just exactly as you think it ought to be, then I shall know they are all right. You know more about things than ever I shall, I am afraid. I am only particular about this one thing, that you shall give yourself as little work and as little anxiety, and spend as little on me as possible, for I honestly don't think any of these things are worth the trouble. If I were going to Washington or Boston, or some of those cities to live, and had a reputation to sustain, it would be different. But I am just to be nobody but a missionary's wife, you know, and live in the backwoods." Whereupon Helen would fold up her work, looking serenely happy the while, and set off for a tramp into the West End with Mr. Leonard. "Going down in the very scum to practice," Maria would say, with a turned-up nose. "I should think they might wait until they got out West." For the West End of that little city was another name for 5 Points, or some of those well-known resorts. And yet Maria, looking after them both, was proud with a pride that no sight of Helen in her silken robes, and poor Horace Monroe in his lavender kids, had ever awakened. Mr. Leonard had brought his Western habits with him, and wore no gloves at all. All anxiety in regard to the effect of such unusual excitement on the invalid was quieted by his evident satisfaction in, and enjoyment of, his prospective son-in-law. Mr. Randolph's own very early life had been spent in the West, and the family were intimately connected with the home mission work in its earlier days. Old memories, therefore, were revived, and the green spot in his heart blossomed and glowed under the thought that the Randolph blood would flow again in the old channel. Despite all bewilderments as to plans, preparations for the coming event went swiftly forward. The days went forward rapidly, too, and brought them presently to the very breakfast over which Maria had done much needless worrying. For it transpired that Tom finally took the matter in hand, and a strong force from the Randolph house came over to do everything in perfection, Tom declaring that the care of the father and the bride were as much as Maria's nerves ought to manage. So, though there were almost no guests, Peter Armstrong only being invited in token of his former place in the family, and Dick Norton being added, for no other reason than because it suited Maria's fancy to include him, the breakfast was as dainty and tasteful in all its details as though the guests had been numerous. Also Maria had done some worrying over Grace coming home so soon and mingling again with the obnoxious Alfred. That, too, being needless, as it transpired, for Mr. Harper came alone. Ermina was not quite well, and Grace thought it not wise to leave her alone, as she was very anxious that he should attend. Maria heard and mused as to whether Ermina had considerately sickened at this opportune time, in order to arrange this convenient and satisfactory program. Mr. Harper brought their love and remembrance in the shape of a trunk full of most satisfactory things, chosen, Mr. Leonard said, with as much wisdom as though they had been the granddaughters of pioneer missionaries, and Mr. Randolph answered with pride, "They are." To Maria came a little private note from Grace, containing these, only these, words, much underscored: "Dear Maria, won't you please invite Alfred to the wedding for my sake? Please do, that's a dear sister. Gracie." Over this note Maria gloomed and scolded, and finally settled down into the serene conviction that for once everything was going nicely. For it transpired that the said Alfred considerately took himself off on a vacation tour, and did not return in time to be either invited or slighted. So on this morning, when Maria, having no coffee to manage and no Mrs. Dickson to watch as there was in Helen Randolph's time, suddenly remembered that she and Grace paid a last visit to Helen that other time, and had a farewell talk, though there was no Grace to go with her, she decided to go alone. Helen was dressed and standing by the window, looking out. "All ready?" asked Maria, and Helen turned toward her. There were traces of tears in her eyes. "I have been saying good-bye to mother's grave," she said. "Graves seem to me hard things to leave. People who are alive, and from whom I can hear, and to whom I can write long letters, are different. But someway one holds on to graves and wants to be near them." Straightway Maria thought of Horace's grave, and wondered if that was remembered by the widow, who was almost a bride. It did not seem to be the thing to ask, but Helen, as if in answer to her thoughts, suddenly added, "Some graves are very hard to think about. There has been one very bitter spot in my life that, however much joy may come to me in the future, I can never forget. If I had been a different woman, Horace's grave might have been bright with the light of resurrection. Think of that! Oh, Maria, I hope you will never have to look on any grave and feel that thought." The tears were flowing freely now. "Come," said Maria, not knowing what to say. "I wouldn't cry. You will look like a fright. What will Mr. Leonard think?" "He'll know that there were no tears shed about him," Helen said, quickly, and her eyes flashed with a sudden brightness. Altogether, it was in striking contrast with that other call. Maria felt the difference and respected it. Life was changed, and circumstances were changed, and yes, Helen was changed by something besides time and circumstances. Some great motive power had come into her life and lifted her up. It had been so with Ermina, it had been so with Tom. "I am left at the bottom," she said to herself, with that queer, choking feeling in her throat again. And yet she would stay at the bottom. Wasn't she a strange girl? End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The Next Thing. "What next, I wonder?" It was Maria who said this. She and Tom were turning away from the depot once more. They had been watching a departing train. Mr. and Mrs. Leonard were being whirled off on their western journey. The last flutter of Helen's handkerchief had just disappeared from view. Mr. Harper had departed in the train which went east just 5 minutes before this one started west. So there was nothing for it, Maria said, but to go home and be humdrum. That wedding was a very quiet and a very pretty affair. Brides can look well even in empress cloth, as Maria discovered. Something about Helen was wonderfully becoming. She had never looked so well, nor appeared so well, in her life before. Some discussion had been held as to the proper place for the couple to stand during the ceremony, but it finally arranged itself in a manner that had not been thought of till the last minute. It was found, on the morning in question, that Mr. Randolph appeared too feeble to sit up, so the bridal party stood directly at the foot of his bed. "Helen Munro being married in the bedroom!" was Maria's amazed comment to Tom, when she went to tell him of the change of plans. "What does she think of it?" Tom asked. "She? Why, it was her own proposal. She would not mind being married in the pantry. I am not sure but she would think it more convenient, and trouble could be saved by taking a cold bite off the pantry shelves. Mr. Leonard, or somebody else, has transformed her. I should have to begin and get acquainted with her all over again if she were going to stay at home." That walk from the depot was the opportunity for more gloomy lookings forward into the future. They had dismissed the carriage in order to have a long walk and talk together. "There isn't any next," Maria said, answering her own question. "Everything that can possibly happen to our family has happened. There is absolutely nothing but sweeping and dusting and getting dinners for the future." Tom shivered visibly. "Maria, how can you talk so recklessly, even in sport?" And his voice was almost stern. "You surely see ways in which great and terrible changes could come to us as a family, changes which we have almost held our breaths for fear it would come. Do not let us court them by a spirit of unrest." "If you mean father," said Maria, with utmost coolness, as if every nerve in her heart did not quiver, "I see that he grows stronger every hour. Mr. Harper said the improvement in him during the short time since he had seen him was very marked. Why, Tom, if you were not as blind as a bat, you would see it too. Fancy our allowing him, 3 months ago, to go through such an experience as he had this morning." "I do see it," Tom said, "with a very thankful heart, I assure you. And yet, Maria, you and I know he is far from well, and we do not know what our Father in heaven has decided concerning him." Maria twitched angrily. "Don't," she said sharply. "I don't want to hear that sort of talk. Father is going to get well again. I know it as well as though I saw him on the street this morning. Let me have so much comfort in the world." What was the use of talking to Maria? Tom felt, with a sigh, that she was not in the least subdued. Meantime, changes were coming swiftly. Maria had hardly time to settle down after the unwonted excitement, to the quiet of the times that had come to them, before plans started up which made a great stir in the household, and especially in her heart. She was in the kitchen. The rain was falling softly out of doors. But before it commenced, Son and Air had done duty in drying and whitening a great basket of clothes. Over these, Maria, in trim kitchen apron, cuffs off and sleeves rolled up, was now at work, sprinkling and rolling into tight little heaps ready for the next day's ironing. The gate clicked, and she wondered whether Tom was going to take pity on them and come over to supper. It was a quick, manly step, and came round to the side door, yes, and came in without knocking. Of course it was Tom. She turned to greet him, and said, in alarmed surprise, "My conscience!" "It is only your brother," Mr. Harper said, shaking the rain from his hat, and opening the door again to let out his umbrella. "I have surprised you, haven't I?" "What's the matter? Is it Gracie or Ermina?" Mr. Harper laughed reassuringly. "It is neither," he said. "They are perfectly well and send love. The fact is, I had a plan which I am trying to develop. I came up to talk to you about it. I came round to the side door because I thought it was about time for your father's afternoon nap, and I feared the bell might disturb him. How is he?" "He is better. I think he improves every day." "That is encouraging for my plan, then. Do you know it is about him that I have come?" And Mr. Harper took a seat on the corner of the table and unfolded his plan. It overwhelmed Maria with astonishment and dismay. There was an earnest argument, somewhat heated on her part. Tom found them still talking when he came, almost an hour afterwards. "What in the world is the matter?" he said, quite as much surprised as Maria had been. "I have come all the way from New York to unfold a plan which has filled me with satisfaction, and to my sorrow I find that our good practical sister does not approve at all." This Mr. Harper said while he was shaking hands with Tom. "Of course I don't," said Maria, with energy. "I wonder how I could be expected to? Tom, he wants to carry father off to New York now." "To New York?" echoed Tom in astonishment. "Yes, I am encouraged to feel that a change of air and of physicians will work great results for him. I believe the doctors are mistaken in thinking his lungs hopelessly diseased. I believe he can be cured." "Of course he can be," chimed in Maria, "and he is being cured as fast as possible. See how he has improved in the last 4 weeks. But if you carry him off to New York, you will just upset it all. I don't like it at all." Though there was grim determination in this, there was also an undertone of satisfaction, as one who knew she reigned there, and that it would be very hard to carry out plans to which she did not consent. Tom seemed astonished. "But, Maria," he said, "think how often we have said, if he could only have salt air to breathe, and be under the care of Dr. Conyers." "What do I know about Dr. Conyers? Because he lives in New York is no sign he knows more than all creation. What I say is that a sick man needs his own home and his own things about him, and he needs my care too. You will find that he, at least, will object to going away from me." Mr. Harper interrupted eagerly. "My dear sister, did you suppose for a moment that we could think of having father go without you? I took it for granted that your good sense would know yourself included in this arrangement. Of course he needs you. No other could take your place." "Well, I shall never go, you may feel sure of that. I am not going to have the name of living upon my brother-in-law so long as I can earn my own living." And Maria, as she jerked these words out between lips that wanted to quiver, sprinkled the clothes with an energy that sent the water over Mr. Harper's broadcloth. He wiped the shining drops off composedly as he answered. "That is a very foolish way to talk, Maria. Not at all in accordance with your usual good sense. I am your brother-in-law, however much you may feel disposed to ignore the relationship, and as such have certain rights and privileges. I know you do not mean that you will not do whatever shall seem in the end to be the best thing for the father, whose health and welfare are to be put by us all before any other consideration. What we want is to talk this matter over calmly, and then decide as shall seem best to us all." He might as well have talked about talking calmly with a tornado. Maria's blood was all on fire. She was like a lion afraid of being robbed of her young. Her father had so long been her charge, had been so entirely under her sway, that to give up the right to plan and work and sacrifice for him was like giving up her life. For the time she was incapable of reasoning or of talking intelligently on the subject. So Mr. Harper presently decided, and, breaking off suddenly, he began to talk to Tom about the Randolph house, and finally went away with him to have a look at certain improvements in the reading-room. They both came back to tea, Maria having gained sufficient control to say that her father would be ready to see them at that time. At table the subject came up again, Mr. Harper apparently being no whit less determined, and Maria being calmer, having had time to intrench herself in the firm belief that her father would put an end to all such planning. By mutual consent the subject was not broached to the invalid that night. But Mr. Harper commenced it promptly the next morning. It was a stormy day with Maria; also it was a day in which much planning was done. Contrary to the expectations of any, and the hope of one, Mr. Randolph entered with eagerness into the new plans. He had long felt that a mistake was being made in his case. Latterly he had begun to hope and believe that if he could get a change of air, above all a whiff of sea air, perhaps he might get strength again to support his family. He was willing, nay anxious, to try this proposed change. He was deeply grateful for the thoughtful love that had planned it. More than that, he agreed with Maria that it would be better for her to remain behind to look after the old home, and the cow, and the hens, and the garden, and all those tiresome details that need so much looking after, and that are looked after so thankfully when there is someone in the house for whose comfort you are planning, and to whose comforts they will add a share. But how utterly trivial they become when you are only taking care of them because they must be taken care of. Maria realized this part, but she had little more to say. Indeed, you would have pitied her if you had been in the kitchen with her while she washed the dishes that had come from her father's room. Her hands moved slowly, as if they had lost their energy. Every now and then a great tear splashed on the table, or was brushed suddenly as it was about to fall. Her father was willing to go away, to leave the little room that she had made so sweet and fair for him, and that she had so delighted to fill with all the comforts her hands could furnish. He was willing to go without her, to be waited upon by other hands than hers. How could he think that she could bear it? Mr. Harper felt sorry for her, and objected earnestly to the plan of leaving her at home, helped, however, by neither father nor Tom. Mr. Randolph said that she had been confined too closely to a sick room, that she needed rest and change almost as much as he did, that she was growing old before her time. "It has been a loving service," he said, looking after her with eyes that glistened, "but it has been a hard one for a girl of her age. She needs her freedom for a little while. She will stay at the Randolph house and look after Thomson, and get rested and brightened up, and then everything will be looked after at home." "Then would it not be better to explain to her that it is for her sake you wish her to remain, and not because of the house?" Mr. Harper asked the question. He could not bear that the sore heart should be made sorer by being apparently underrated. Mr. Randolph shook his head with a smile. "You do not understand my youngest daughter as well as you do Ermina," he said. "I doubt if she would do anything for her own sake. She understands the art of doing for others, but she is too young to understand that each one owes a duty to himself in this world that cannot rightly be neglected. She needs to learn that." Tom said nothing until his brother and himself were walking downtown. Then to Mr. Harper's anxious remark, "It seems to be a mistake leaving Maria behind. I am sorry for her. She has lived for father so long that she will not know how to live without him. Besides, he will miss her more, I am afraid, than he realizes." "He realizes it," Tom said, with a smile. "The truth is, my father is sublimely unselfish. He sees, I think, that it is for Maria's good. I believe she needs to learn that life can go on without her. Not that she is conceited in the usual acceptation of that word, but she has so long managed us all, and especially father, that she feels herself absolutely necessary to the affairs of this life. She has not a grain of trust in her nature. I doubt if she could be got to go to New York and live with your family even for father's sake. Independence is her weakness, a good trait carried to excess. Maria has to have everything in excess. It is her nature." "Is she progressing any, do you think? Has she discovered yet that it is hard to live by her motto while she ignores the foundation?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know what she has discovered," he said gravely. "She has admitted nothing of the sort. The fact is, Maria, more than any other person I ever knew, needs to be taught the lesson of dependence. She doesn't want to depend on anybody but her own self. She even rebels at the idea of a daily dependence on God. She thinks herself sufficient to herself, apparently, not only for this life, but for the life to come. Sometimes I tremble for her, and wonder how it will be necessary to teach her the lesson. I hope to do something for her while she is at the Randolph house. We have good influences there now in every direction." He need not have built many plans on that hope. If Maria would not go to New York, neither, it appeared, would she go to the Randolph house. Somewhat crushed she was by having discovered that her will was not so potent as she had imagined. But only crushed, not broken. If she could not control the disposal of other people, she could at least control herself. She kept her own counsel. She worked day and night to prepare her father. She planned indefatigably for his comfort. It was her hand that arranged his collar and necktie on the morning of the prospective journey. It was her hand that arranged the pillows at his back when he was seated in the carriage. It was she who arranged a couch for him in the palace car that had been retained for this occasion. It was she who saw the annoying sunbeam creeping in at the wrong corner and shining right in his eyes. It was she who hovered around him, anticipating every motion, every fancy. She made herself an absolute necessity until the train gave its warning whistle. She wrung from him, with the good-bye kiss, this tender whisper, "My darling child, I could not bear this separation even for a little while, if it were not for your good." "My good?" she said to herself, with a grim smile, as she watched the train around the curve. "What possible good does he think can come to me? If harm doesn't come to him through it all, I shall be only too thankful. But I shall have him back in a little while. They will all see their folly. I only hope it may not do any mischief that I cannot repair." Then she turned to Tom. "Well, here we are again at this depot. Can't we just take rooms here and wait for astonishing things to happen? They all seem to center around departing trains. Tom, either you or I must get married or go to Europe for the next event. That is absolutely all there is left to happen now." Tom turned away in silence. He was not constituted like Maria. His father had looked very pale and feeble. It was a hazardous experiment after all. Who could tell whether they were ever to see the dear face again in life? He could not put on gaiety of voice just then, even to help Maria. He could sleep quietly and calmly tonight after his earnest prayer for his father's safety, sleep quietly while she was burying her lonely head in her pillow and sobbing aloud in her loneliness and sore-heartedness. But there was the difference between the two natures. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of the Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Signs Not Understood. "When will you be over to the house?" Tom asked as the carriage rolled toward home. "Oh, I don't know. I'll call as usual, I suppose, whenever the spirit moves me." "Maria, what do you mean? Aren't you coming over there to live?" "Not by any means am I. So long as I have a house of my own to live in, I am not disposed to live on charity, especially as I have a trade and can support myself." Of course this was the beginning of a long discussion. Tom dismissed the carriage and went into the deserted house and sat down to it. But he might as well have discussed it with the wind. Maria was even less reasonable than usual. It appeared that she had her plans all formed. She was going to stay in the house, of course. How else could she take care of things properly, and be ready for her father when he should return next week or next month? Of course she expected him as soon as that. Sooner. She had no hope at all of this wild scheme doing him any good. She was not so foolish. If it only didn't do him permanent harm, she should be thankful. No, she was not afraid in the least. What on earth was there to be afraid of more than there was when her father lay sick and helpless in that bedroom? She had not been supposed to be afraid then. Why must she be so now? Do? He would find that there was plenty of work that even she could do, if she wasn't of sufficient consequence to have her opinion count for anything. In short, she had her way, of course, as she meant to have from the first. All the more determined to have it because she had not yet rallied from the disappointment and humiliation of being overmatched in this last planning. Tom went away at last, more thoroughly vexed with her than he had ever allowed himself to be before. The utmost concession that she could be prevailed upon to make was to submit, it must be confessed with a very ill grace, to Tom's quiet announcement that since she would be so foolish and unkind, she must take the extra work of getting a room ready for him, for he should sleep in the house, of course. And when she rudely questioned what earthly use there was in putting himself and her to that extra trouble, he answered more coldly than she had ever known him to, "That you find it necessary to ask such a question only goes to prove how young and foolish you are, and how very improper it is for you to be left to yourself." And then Tom allowed himself to bang the door just a little, and as he went downtown he felt that really he had a most heavy and most unwilling responsibility. His heart would have been softer if he could have seen how bitterly the stoical sister cried the moment the door banged after him. She really was sore-hearted, and she did not understand the feeling. Tom found it difficult to determine whether the strongest feeling was vexation or amusement when he made his next call in the daytime and discovered the improvement that had been made. The old Randolph homestead, which had sheltered a long line of Randolphs, not imposing in any way, but eminently respectable, had a new ornament, a sign tacked in a conspicuous spot, and the letters on it were unmistakably clear and plain. "Clear starching and fine ironing done here." Tom was democratic. He thought no one could be more so. He was most remarkably free from false pride. Had he not been a street-car driver? Yet this sign made the blood flow faster in his veins. It did seem a little too great a departure from the beaten track, especially since now, more than at any time during the last struggling years of their fortunes, it was unnecessary. The troubled brother walked quite past the house and took a turn around the block, before he had settled in his mind how to treat this new departure. Acting upon a plan thus carefully considered, he had been in the house 10 minutes before he made any remark concerning the sign. Then he said, in as quiet and careless a voice as he could assume, "You have enlarged your business, I see. Do you propose to take in a partner?" "Perhaps I shall, if I can find one of sufficient mental capacity to be of use. Have you a protégé that you want to get rid of?" "Not at present. What was the object of the enlargement?" "No special object, only you seemed afraid that I would lack for occupation, and as I didn't seem to be of use to anybody, nor have any sphere whatever in life, I concluded to make one for myself, or to make money at least. There is money in it. If you need any to carry on your schemes, you will know where to come." "He doesn't care what I do, nor how many signs I tack to the old house, so that I don't trouble him." This Maria said with a swelling heart, as she watched that same brother walk away a few minutes thereafter, without raising his eyes to the sign. He, on his part, drew a long sigh, and said, "She will have to learn by experience. I see no other way, and I don't know how to help her in the least." After all, they understood each other's hearts about as well as those articles get understood in this surface world. Outwardly, I shall have to admit that Maria's plan bade fair to succeed better than anything that the Randolphs had ever undertaken, that is, so far as their purses were concerned. Maria had said truly that there was money in it, provided, she was apt to add, you have no pride to speak of, and a good strong back. While the world seems to be full of people who are willing to teach our children to strum on the piano, to draw impossible-looking trees and people, to jabber in a dozen different tongues, the lamentable fact remains that in every town and city it is really a difficult matter to get one's collars and cuffs starched and ironed decently without paying a fabulous price for it. As Maria had a great deal of pride of execution, and an indomitable determination, and a secret plan to make herself and her father independent thereby, she worked with a will, and in process of time actually took in, Not partners exactly, but hard-working girls who were glad to be taught that which she had worked out by her own wits and the help of her eyes when she visited certain famous laundries. For time went on, and the father did not return to them. In fact, she became unwilling to have him return, though this she did not own to anybody. But she gloated in secret joy over the wonderful accounts of rapid progress and increasing strength. There came a day when her eyes were red all day with the happy tears she had shed in the privacy of her own room the night before, over a half-dozen lines actually written her by her father's hand, in which words he communicated to her his dear ambition to get well enough to go back to his clerkship, so that she might have leisure and money in return for all her self-sacrificing love. "He will never do it if I can help it," she said with energy, and she ironed 11 shirts that day. She saw a way to help it by making it unnecessary. This she would do if they would give her time enough, so she became reconciled to the visit to New York. So the days passed, and snarly March, and tearful April, and uncertain May came and went again, and, except a flying visit from Mr. Harper, none of the New York family were to be seen. Mr. Harper came with plans. They wanted to take father to the White Mountains. Grace had been studying hard, and needed the change, and the doctor said nothing wiser could be done for the father, so he had come down to see about it. Father was anxious to have Maria go. He longed for a sight of her. Besides, he felt sure she needed the change. Unlucky sentence! Maria was inexorable. Her heart throbbed fast at the thought of getting through the long summer without one peep at her father, but she was taking care of herself, and was not to be cuddled at the White Mountains, or any other mountains, on the plea that she needed anything. "I am willing father should go," was her magnanimous conclusion. "I have no doubt that it will do him good. Your plan of taking him to New York has resulted as I never thought it would. But there is no use in talking about my going, because I can't and won't." I hope they appreciated this admission. It cost Maria a great deal to make it, and it was splendid in her. It was more than for most people to get down on their knees and humbly beg your pardon. It was her misfortune, perhaps, rather than her fault, that she was gifted with a marvelously obstinate disposition, though, to be sure, she had done what she could to cultivate her gifts in that direction. But no amount of coaxing served to change in the least her determination not to be made happy herself. Other people might be as happy as they could, she was going to wash and iron clothes. That is what it looked like to Tom and Mr. Harper. They knew nothing at all about her bank account or her cherished plans. But our washerwoman had long, lonely hours in which she could neither wash nor iron, and in which she did not know what to do with herself. Tom was so busy and so eager over his hotel, and his reading room, and his Sabbath services, and his 100 other plans, some in which she could not, and others in which she would not be interested, and allow herself to help, that he had little leisure time to bestow. In fact, it was not till years after that it dawned upon Maria that he actually made a sacrifice of time and convenience in order to occupy at night the pleasant little room which she took care to make so inviting for him. She was still skeptical over the hotel. Not that she did not see and feel the good it was doing, not that she did not admire the idea, only how was Tom ever to marry and support a family on fine ideas? All the more she felt this for being present one evening when the accounts had been gone over, closing the financial year of the house. Mr. Harper and Tom had been at work all day. An hour before she had heard Mr. Harper say, "Now, subtracting the expenditures for furniture and for extra matters that will not naturally come in another year, how do we balance as to accounts?" Then there had been some very silent and rapid figuring on Tom's part, until presently he sat back with the lines of crimson creeping up on his forehead, and the white lines about his mouth, showing how intense and keen was his interest in this experiment. "We net just exactly 72 cents," he said, trying to control the tremble in his voice. Instantly Mr. Harper stretched his hand across the table and grasped Tom's in an eager grip. "Victory!" he said in a voice of triumph. "Then it is demonstrated beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt that a first-class hotel can be sustained with even a moderate degree of patronage, and not have a drop of liquor brought into it. I congratulate you, my brother. Are you ready to go on with the work?" "If it fell 72 cents behind, instead of netting that, I should try to contrive some way to earn that sum and go ahead," said Tom, trying to cover his evident emotion with gaiety. "But your property at that rate is lying waste, even if we should do so well in the next year, and your expenses for furnishings have been enormous." "My property belongs to the cause, and sinks or swims with it. I am grateful to you for letting it help." Mr. Harper said this quietly, but with shining eyes, and both gentlemen arose and shook hands again, even as they had done after the first compact between them. But I regret to be obliged to state that poor mercenary Maria looked scornful. 72 cents! She said within her heart. "How does the boy ever expect to support a family with such an income as that? And it will grow worse instead of better, for he will have new schemes every year." And she made a resolution to work harder than ever at her chosen calling. Some of them must have some money. That was the evening before the 4th of July. Maria had so far laid aside her obstinacy that she came over to the Randolph house, "bag and baggage," as she phrased it, to spend the 4th. A curious intimacy had sprung up between Maria and the girl Maggie. For the first time in her life Maria was near having a particular friend. Maggie interested her as no girl or woman had ever done before. To those few among her acquaintances who were sufficiently intimate to remonstrate with her on the strangeness of making a friend out of a "hired girl," Maria delighted to answer, "She is a pastry cook, and I am a washerwoman. What is the difference?" So she spent the 4th in the Randolph kitchen, helping Maggie to concoct elegant desserts for the unusual rush of visitors. She and Maggie were the only ones who did not desert the work in the kitchen for a sight at the parade, and it was not until everything was in order for the night that the two girls decided to take their holiday by mounting to the highest balcony that overlooked the square and getting a view of the fireworks. "I like bonfires better than any of these new-fashioned fizzes, rockets, and Roman candles, and all those. I used to like the fireballs that they whirled through the air. I don't care if they were dangerous. They were a dozen times more romantic than these namby-pamby affairs." This Maria said as she watched the flames curling slowly around a great pyramid of tar barrels, gathering strength and volume every minute, and beginning to light up the square with a lurid glare. Maggie made no answer. She was watching the curling flames like one fascinated. "I like them too," she said after a little. "I like power." The way in which she spoke those words, under her breath, made Maria smile as she looked curiously at her. "She has power," she said to herself. "I wonder what she would do in an emergency. I don't believe she would faint or scream. I'd like to know." "I'm glad I haven't power," began Maggie again. "I should be afraid of myself. I think I might do something dreadful just for the sake of doing it. If I had the power of God, for instance, I would sweep out half the people of the world at one swoop, I think." "No, you wouldn't," said Maria, amused and yet a little startled. "You would hate to destroy machines that your own power had made." "No, I shouldn't. Not if they utterly disappointed me, failed, you know, of the object for which they were made." There was something in that. Maria went to thinking about it, and found she had no reply ready. Still the flames grew and made more sunlight in the square. The faces of the people looked weird and fantastic in the growing glare. Suddenly Maggie gave a little scream. Not a scream either. It was not loud enough for that. It was the suggestion of a scream that a strong will had instantly suppressed. She clutched Maria's arm. "What on earth is the matter?" Maria said, greatly startled. Before the sentence was concluded, Maggie said, "Do you see that man standing by the lamp-post, the blue light-post, with a child in his arms?" Yes, he was defined distinctly against the dark background. A glow of light shone full upon the child's face. "That man," said Maggie, and again there was that sense of a powerful, controlling will about her voice, "that man is my husband, and he has my baby in his arms." All this was said in an instant of time. Swift and low her voice had been, and the grasp on Maria's arm had been like a vice. Then she was off, through the room, down the hall, down the stairs, down another hall, another flight of stairs, so swift and noiseless that she seemed almost like a spirit, and though Maria followed, breathless and panting, it was hard to keep her in sight. Chapter 26 of the Randolphs, by Pansy. Chapter 26 Emergencies. By dint of eager pushing and breathless haste, Maria kept the flying feet ahead of her in sight, and at last they reached the goal. Such a wonderful change as those few minutes had accomplished! Where was the light which had made a glow on all the faces but a moment before? A sudden tumbling of a few tar barrels, a sudden change in the current of wind, and that part of the square was in gloom. Besides, the people, tired suddenly, it would seem, of the sight on which they were so eagerly gazing but a moment before, had surged and swayed, and were breaking in all directions, men, women, and children, in crowds and throngs, but not the man or the child, at least Maggie seemed not to find them, as she pushed her way through, peering eagerly into the face of every man or woman who held a child by the hand. It was a hopeless search. It looked so to Maria in a very few minutes after she got among that throng, yet she dared not speak, dared not say, "It is of no use, the child is gone, you were mistaken, or if you were not, he is lost in the crowd." That would seem too bitter a thing to say, so near to him and yet to have lost him. Could any pain be harder than that? "It was perfectly awful," she said, telling over the experience to Tom the next day, for the search ended, and they got back to the hotel, Maria hardly knew how. "I don't know how Maggie could have felt. I know I felt like death. Was there ever anything so dreadful?" "The police ought to have been instantly notified," said Tom. "Such precious time was lost." "The police!" echoed Maria, and her countenance fell. "Why, what could they do, and how should they have been notified?" "Do? They could have stationed guards and watched the trains and boats. There were 3 trains and 2 boats left before they were notified. They could have been sure that the persons were not in any of them. It would have been easy enough to notify them. Any decent man you met would have sent a message to headquarters. You should learn what to do in emergencies, Maria." Now, wasn't this a hard sentence to bear? She, who had prided herself on her talent for managing emergencies, who had puzzled her brains half the night over the query, what could she do to help Maggie, and had finally settled down into the belief that there was nothing to do but accept the hard fate. Then she spent hours in planning what might have been done. How easy God might have ruled that they should have been in time to have seized that child, and have borne him off in triumph. This was what she would have arranged had she ruled the world. By so much then was she wiser and more merciful than God. She did not see that this was the inevitable conclusion which her logic reached. She would have been shocked at that thought. Most grumblers would be shocked at the mathematical results of their reasoning. But now Maria was more than shocked, she was disgusted. And of all persons with whom to be disgusted in this trying world, the most trying one is one's self, because one does not like to set to work and give one's self a real downright talking to, though nothing could be more profitable sometimes. Maria contented herself with frowning gloomily. "I wonder she didn't think of that," she said at last, the necessity for blaming somebody seeming to be upon her. "I don't wonder at that at all. She was almost wild, I suppose, and was not to be expected to think connectedly. The wonder is that you allowed such a sensible move as that to be neglected for so long a time." "How should I think anything about the police?" grumbled Maria. "I haven't had to do with such scrapes." "Then I advise you to impress it upon your memory, that, hereafter, when you want to find a lost child, the most reasonable thing you can do is to notify the authorities whose business it is to help you, and the sooner you do this, the better will you exhibit your common sense." Tom spoke quickly, vexed by Maria's apparent hardness into a departure from his quiet manner. "Have you been over to see Maggie this morning?" he presently asked, speaking in his usual tone. "No, I haven't, and I have no desire to go." "Why?" "Because I have a little bit of feeling left, though you seem to think you are the only one so affected. I don't want to see her. I cannot imagine anything more terrible. It is a wonder to me that she keeps her senses. I wonder what she thinks of all her prayers now. Great good they did. It was as bad as losing him the second time, just a tantalizing glimpse and then gone. I should go wild, or be an infidel. I'm sure I have nothing at all to say to comfort her. If anybody has, I advise them to say it. All I can say is, I don't understand such dealings. There is no man living who would be so inhuman as that. Can't endure the thought of meeting her again." Tom smiled a peculiar smile. "You go over and see her, Maria. Go as soon as you can. It will do you good." Now, though Maria had not the slightest intention of following this advice, though she assured herself that she wouldn't go near there for at least a week, an irresistible impulse seemed to draw her in that direction. She went that very afternoon, went up the stairs with a softly tread, such as one instinctively assumes in the presence of death, and tapped softly at the door. No answer. Was Maggie buried among her pillows in bitter weeping, or was she sitting in apathy, her senses dulled by the bitterness of her grief? Maria waited a minute, then softly opened the door. The room was vacant. Maria preserved an outward calm, but in inward anxiety sought for her friend. Who could tell but in her despair she had wandered away, as she had done before, leaving no trace of her flight? One and another of the girls she met, putting the same question, "Do you know where Maggie is?" and received the same answer, "No, ma'am, I haven't seen her since dinner." It began now to grow very serious. Still Maria bravely kept her own counsel, for which she could not be too thankful, when she finally reached the storeroom and found Maggie weighing out sugar preparatory to making sponge cake for tea. She was very pale, and there were dark rings under her eyes, as one might look who had not slept much the night before, and who had shed some hot tears. But she turned with her usual smile to greet her friend. "I have been hoping for you all day," she said, speaking with utmost quietness of voice. "I was afraid the wild way I led you last night might have tired you very much." "I am not so easily tired, but I am very much astonished. I went to your room and expected to find you in bed." "Oh, no, I am not sleepy. I slept some last night, and I have had to be very busy all day. I suppose there is no news yet?" and she looked up with a sudden gleam of wild hope in her eyes. Maria shook her head. "Your brother has been so kind," she said. "He was up half the night, putting the police on the track, writing out descriptions of them to post in conspicuous places, and I don't know what he has done. Everything that could be done, I am sure. What a blessed thing it is to have such friends at such a time." "Do you expect any results?" Maria asked, skeptically. She was so wonderfully quiet, and stirred that flour and egg so dexterously, it did not seem cruel to say anything to her. "Results? Indeed I do. I feel hopeful to-day, more so than I have for a long time. I have had a good deal to encourage me. Think what a blessed sight it was! I saw my darling as plainly as I see you at this moment, and he looked plump and well, and he clung to his papa's neck, not as if he were frightened, but as if he was happy and enjoyed it all. And his papa was sober. I know that, for I have watched him so long and so well, I can tell with one swift glance. Oh, if there was ever a direct answer to prayer, my gleam last night was one. My prayer has been a mixture of petition and thanksgiving to-day." Now all this might as well have been spoken in Greek, so far as Maria's understanding of such a state of mind was concerned. But that which we do not understand can sometimes thrill us mightily, and Maria Randolph turned away from that pantry door with a strange sense of her own littleness and uselessness, and of the wonderful nature of prayer. "I admire her pluck, anyhow," she said. But she knew it was not pluck. She knew it was something that she had not, and that Maggie had never possessed until that night when she learned to pray. She had taken great strides in the Christian life in a little time. A great sorrow is a wonderful educator. But all that Maria did not understand. She went directly home, and she thought much about it all during the rest of that day. "If you would go and hear him," said Dick Norton, speaking to her with a sort of wistful earnestness that amused, while it surprised her, "you would know how he says these things that I try to tell you. They ain't queer as they sound when I tell them in a blundering fashion. They are worth hearing." "What if I should go?" Maria said, pausing on her way to the pantry as she cleared the tea-table. Tom had been over to tea, and the table had been set with ceremony once more. "That is a new idea. I am eager for something new. I live a stupid life nowadays. But this is the reading-room night, isn't it? My brother will be engaged. Dick, will you take care of me if I will go to the meeting with you?" "I will that. There is nothing I would like to do better." The energy with which he spoke amused her again, and, adding to the sudden impulse to have something new in her humdrum life a kindly desire to give Dick Norton pleasure, she made ready to accompany him to the Fleet Street Church to hear the minister who had been preaching there every evening for a week, and in whom Dick was wonderfully interested. The church was crowded when they reached there, and the exercises were commenced. A gentleman arose to let Maria have his seat. She glanced up at him with a bow of thanks. He had a child in his arms, a little boy. The boy had an arm wound half around the gentleman's neck, and his hand toyed caressingly with gray locks of hair. The sermon may have been effective. Indeed, I know it was. There were those present who will remember it, not only for this world, but for the next, because of the power it had in influencing their future lives. But Maria heard not a word of it all. From first to last she never took her fascinated eyes away from the face of the man who held the little child in his arms, and who found a sitting on one of the aisle seats near her. She shielded her gaze by peeping through her fingers, but not a movement of the strangers escaped her. Something, she could not have told what or why, either the caressing hand of the child, or the likeness to the shadow which she had seemed to find against the glare of light in the square, or the mysterious sense of insight that seems sometimes given, either or all of these so powerfully impressed the matter-of-fact Maria Randolph that she had just self-control enough left to wait with feverish impatience for the benediction before she executed a bold plan which she had formed. "Follow close to me, Dick, and don't let that man escape us for the world." This was the tragic whisper that fell on Dick's astonished ear as the Amen was spoken, and the crowd began to surge toward the door. There was to be an inquiry meeting, and many stood quietly in their seats waiting for the people to pass out. Maria moved toward the door, followed closely by Dick, and she on her part following with eager steps the man who held the little child, now sleeping quietly in his arms. In the vestibule he halted. So did Maria. "Won't you go to the second meeting?" a man asked, stopping before the stranger. "I would," he said promptly, "if it were not for my little boy. He ought to be at rest." "We need much help tonight," the other said. "It is a blessed time." And the man with the child answered heartily, "Indeed it is." Every word he spoke made it less probable that Maria was right, yet she clung to her determination. No police could be more vigilant than she would be tonight. She turned toward him. "Dick, stand close by me," she said in a low tone. Then she addressed the stranger. Aren't you Mr. Harry Reeder? And isn't this child named Wallace?" He looked down at her quickly. "Yes," he said, and if Maria had not been intent on carrying out her plans, she would have noted the sudden catching of his breath. "Who are you?" "Never mind who I am. If you will give me that child, I will take him to his mother, and the sooner you give yourself into the hands of the police as a disreputable vagrant, the less trouble you will make us all." Maria prided herself on the cool contempt, stinging in every word, of this sentence. So sure was she of her man that she had been preparing this message during the sermon. She had not planned the result that speedily followed. She had reckoned as if the man before her were a puppet to be played on as she chose. Had she leveled a pistol at his heart and taken true aim, he couldn't have dropped more suddenly and silently than he did before her. There was much confusion now, and Maria had the benefit of seeing how well she could act in an emergency. Her wits served her well. She talked rapidly and to the point. "Don't surround him so," she said. "The man is in a dead faint. I gave him news too suddenly. Take the child, one of you. Dick, call a carriage. Or no, one of you gentlemen please call a carriage, and then if you will help him into it, we shall be all right in a few minutes. Dick, see here, get a policeman to take a ride with us." This in a low tone to the amazed Dick. Then Maria raised her eyes again and met the searching gaze of one of Tom's friends. She was equal to that. "Dr. Preston," she said coolly, "I shall have to press you into service. Is this anything more than a faint?" "No," he said quietly. "The man is reviving. What do you want done?" "I want him taken to the Randolph house as speedily as possible. He is one for whom my brother has been searching." In much less time than it has taken me to tell it, the strange party were on their way to the Randolph house. Dr. Preston, who had invited himself to go with them, resting the head of the fainting man on his shoulder, Maria with the sleeping boy in her arms, Dick close beside her, and the policeman mounting guard with the driver, and wondering for what he could be wanted to accompany a respectable-looking party, 3 of them gentlemen, home from a religious meeting. Tom was standing on the brightly lighted piazza, looking after a carriage-load of departing guests. He waited while the next carriage drove up. "What now?" he asked, as the policeman swung himself to the ground. "I don't know, sir," said the policeman, touching his hat. "I am detailed to convey this party from Fleet Street Church to this house, and I believe they are all here." Dick Norton was the first to alight. He could give no sort of information as to why he was there. Dr. Preston followed, steadying the steps of the man, who seemed dizzy and bewildered. "Preston!" exclaimed Tom, his surprise increasing every moment. "What's up?" "A sick man is down, and we are ordered here. For the reason why, ask your sister. I must get this man safe. He is like to faint again." Finally down clambered Maria, clinging closely to the sleeping boy. She issued her orders like a general. "Is he going to faint again, did you say? Take him to the hall sofa. Dick, pay the carriage and dismiss it. Tom, here is Maggie's boy. I have him safe, you see. And, no thank you, I mean to keep him safe until I can put him in her arms. But I desire you to see that I notified the police, as you gave me direction to do. As to what his duty is in the matter, you will have to inform him, for I don't know." And she vanished with her precious burden from Tom's astounded gaze. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. What Maria Did Next. "What that girl will do next is more than I can imagine." That was what her brother Tom said as he followed Maria in, looking after her in a dazed kind of way, before he turned to Dr. Preston and his charge. "The next thing, she will be responsible for a human life, I am afraid," Dr. Preston said, as he bent with grave and troubled face over the apparently lifeless man. "This man has had a fearful shock of some sort. Where is he to be put, Randolph?" whereupon Tom roused himself and gave directions right and left. The doctor looked around him, his eye falling on Dick Norton, who stood waiting and watching. "See here, my man," he said, "can you do an errand for me?" "Yes, sir." The promptness of the answer and something in the tone told how eager was Dick to be made helpful. Dr. Preston drew him on one side, and was evidently giving careful directions, watching him meantime with keen eyes to see whether he took the complicated windings of the different errands into intelligent consideration. Dick listened in silent attention until the sentences were concluded. Then he made one solitary observation. "Do you want me to report on the first errand before I do the others?" "Yes," said the doctor, his eyes lighting. "I do. I had forgotten it." "All right, sir," Dick said, and he was off. It was just that little incident that had to do with Dick Norton's future. It was an anxious night to those interested in the family trouble. The stranger who had so suddenly come among them was wild with delirium all night. Knew neither his wife, who hovered over him, nor the sleeping boy whom they brought to lie beside him. Both Dr. Preston and Dick Norton spent the night, and by tacit consent it seemed to be understood that Dick was the doctor's special helper. With the morning came a change and hopefulness. The fever was subdued, and the patient quietly sleeping. Dr. Preston came from the room on tiptoe. "If he is carefully watched and not unduly excited, he will get along without a fever after all, I think," he said. "His pulse seems to be growing natural. Now, what is it all about? I was never more suddenly whirled into the middle of a mystery, and put so steadily at work that I had not time to question my way out." "What we know of it ourselves can be told in a dozen sentences," Tom said, whereupon he gave the story as far as his knowledge went. "I can guess at some of the rest," Maria said. "It seems Maggie in her wildness never for a moment thought of such a thing as that the man might come to his senses and hunt for her in their old home. She left as suddenly as he did, and in the night, and has never made known to any of the people her whereabouts." "What an idea!" said the doctor. "I know it, but she seems all the time to have been haunted with the idea that he wanted to avoid her, and that he would never come in her supposed vicinity of his own will." Tom drew a long sigh. "For her sake I don't know whether we ought to wish him to live or die," he said sadly. "I suppose there is nothing but trouble in store for her." Maria struggled with her dislike to say a word on that topic, but at last burst forth, "As to that, I suppose you will think he is all right, Tom. He is a convert, it seems, of that man who is preaching every evening down at the Fleet Street Church. He says he followed him here. Dick Norton says he has taken part in the prayer meetings, or inquiry meetings, or whatever you call them, every evening. Done as well as the minister, Dick thinks." She was neither blind nor insensible to the lighting up of both her brother's and the doctor's face. "Thank God!" they both said, speaking in the same breath. And the doctor added reverently, "His ways are certainly not as our ways." "You are not going home?" Tom said, turning to Maria and speaking in a dismayed tone. "Yes, I am. There is nothing for me to do just now. The boy and the patient are both asleep, and the mother is crooning over them both. By and by, when there is work to do, I can come over again. But in the meantime I have some fine ironing that must be done." Dr. Preston was one of the people before whom Maria liked to parade her fine ironing. She went off with a merry good morning, and in a most amiable mood. The world had righted itself once more, and she had come out on top. Once more she was a person of importance, whose rapid and common-sense action had restored the lost child to his mother and the lost husband to his family, though she had not planned that part of it. The first half of the night had been troubled. Who supposed that the man had a brain to be shocked, or a heart to be overstrained? She had no idea of such responsibility, but the shadow was lifting. Dr. Preston had pronounced him almost out of danger, and she was in a fair way to be a heroine. Not that she used that high-sounding word in her thoughts, Not that she realized that she was in any sense working for herself. It was natural for her to plan and perform, and it was very fortunate for a large class of people that such was the case. Can anyone be blamed for liking to be of importance in this world? Throughout all the duties, many and important, of that entire day, Maria carried about with her a sense of satisfaction. She was needed yet, and there were those who realized it. As for Maggie, how would it be possible for her ever to repay what she had done for her? She was glad that it was not possible. She had no desire to work for pay. Maria certainly had a way of making herself a necessity in the world when she chose to do so. She went back to the Randolph house the moment her fine ironing was disposed of, and in the sick room not only, but in the kitchen, taking Maggie's place, and in fact everywhere, her quick wits and willing hands and skillful brain all on the alert, proved that she was mistress of the occasion, or, as she phrased it, was capable of taking care of herself and several other things at the same time. By evening it was almost transformed from a sick room to a place of festival. The shock had been a tremendous one, but the man rallied rapidly and drank in the medicine of his wife's face as if it were a draught from the fountain of life. Even Maria, who had supposed herself helplessly his enemy, felt herself warming toward him as she watched his great hungry eyes following every step of his wife, every change in her countenance. And as she took her way home at nightfall, she said complacently, "Well, it is a fortunate thing that there is such a refuge as religion for such poor weak wretches as he. I'm sure I'm thankful that he has a strong arm to lean on." But as for Maria Randolph, she needs no other arm than her own. She did not say that. The sound of the words would have shocked her. People often think what, to put into words, would make them blush. Maria hurried through her preparations for tomorrow's work, and treated herself to a fresh white ruffled apron as she sat down to await the arrival of her scholar. It was Dick Norton's evening, and his progress of late had been so rapid, his improvement so marked, that it had begun to be a source of great satisfaction, not to say pride, to his young teacher. She had exerted herself to the utmost to give him lessons, not only in spelling and writing, but in etiquette, until really among his companions he was a marvel. Tom, too, had begun to notice the decided change in his manners, and had more than once heartily commended Maria for the work she was doing, and had told her that Dick would have occasion to be thankful to her all his life for the help she was giving him now. Maria was very fond of receiving praise from Tom. She was smiling yet over the pleasant thought of being a real and lasting benefit to him, and planning new ways of helping him, when she heard his quick, eager step on the walk. Only an hour later she just sat there where she had been when he knocked, her cheeks, and indeed her entire face, aflame, her eyes unnaturally bright, and her whole face working, struggling with strong emotions. Whether wounded pride, or anger, or dismay, or amusement, had the mastery, it would have been hard to say. "To think," she burst forth, "that all my planning for him should end in this way! Oh, the idiot! What could have possessed him? Is the world made up of fools, and nothing else? I never heard of anything so perfectly, ridiculously idiotic in my whole life." Should she laugh or should she cry? She felt equally able to do either, but she waived both with a sudden spring, and gave her energies to getting upstairs and out of sound before Tom, who seemed to be unusually early to-night, should let himself in. She was in no mood to talk with him. Usually Tom let himself into the house late at night, and out of it early in the morning. It was no small inconvenience often to get away from the Randolph house, but this was his patient concession to his sister's obstinacy. However, the next morning he lingered late in the hope of a talk with Maria. He even knocked softly at her door and waited a moment, but finally thought better of it and went away. Maria, on her part, waiting in breathless silence over by the window, not choosing to leave her room until she saw him safely around the corner. She still had no desire to meet him. She was still flushed with an unusual excitement, and went about her work with nervous starts, as if on the very edge of expected earthquakes. "There is no telling what may not happen next," she muttered, as she found herself flushing to her temples simply at the sound of the postman's knock. He brought a sealed drop letter, addressed in Tom's familiar hand. "I've been trying for an hour to get over," it said, "but an unusual press of business has held me. I tried to see you last night, but failed in making you hear." "No, you didn't," interpolated Maria. "My dear sister, I know all about it. Dick came, in his excitement and dismay, directly to me, whom, next to you, he considers his best friend. I know it is absurd, and I hardly see what can have possessed the poor fellow, but he is young, you must remember. He was in great distress, feared that you felt yourself insulted. I comforted him, for, after all, however absurd it may be, a human heart is not to be treated scornfully. He is in dead earnest, poor fellow. At least he thinks he is, and his heart is large and honest. Of course I made it plain to him the utter folly of such an idea, and we will arrange so that it shall not be uncomfortable for you. I shall be over during the day if possible, and I beg you will not give me the trouble of looking you up. Your family, husband and boy, are doing well. The doctor pronounces all danger over. In haste, Tom." Maria tore this note into half-inch pieces, and felt like fleeing from the face of the earth, or at least from Tom. But she thought better of it, and presented herself with a very glowing face when he came. It was impossible not to feel horribly embarrassed. Perhaps they did the best thing possible under the circumstances. They both laughed. "Poor fellow," Tom said, when the laugh was over. "I feel just as sorry for him as possible, but it is absurd." "How could he be such an idiot?" Maria said with reddening face. "Well, as to that," Tom said, "he is at the age when it is more natural to be foolish than to be anything else, and as for considering you his best friend, I don't know that I blame him, though of course he has been a simpleton." "What is to be done next?" Maria asked, speaking with evident disgust. It set her brother off into another laugh. "Why, we must send one of you off to that asylum for sick and wounded hearts, I suppose. Which shall it be? I don't think we ought to appeal to our brother-in-law again, do you?" "Tom, don't be more absurd than is necessary under the circumstances." "Why, I'll try not to be, but you see the circumstances warrant a good deal. Well, to be sensible, we have plans all perfected, I think, and I don't know but it is to be the making of the boy. You had given him a lift educationally, and it is just possible that having tasted, he will be on the lookout for more. Of course he must go where he will not annoy you. In fact, it is almost time for him to start." "What a perfectly absurd performance all around! Do you mean to say that the poor fellow must be caught away from the place where he earns his bread and butter, and be smuggled off, because he has made a fool of himself?" "Well, not quite that. Of course he could stay where he is, but it will be infinitely more agreeable for him not to do so. And he has a splendid opportunity to better himself. He deserves a better place in life than that. Now, upon my honor, I think so. And Dr. Preston is going back to New York this very evening, takes the 5:15 express, and he has taken a most remarkable fancy to Dick. So you see the way is clear. He wants an office boy, and Dick wants with all his heart to be the boy." "You didn't tell Dr. Preston?" Maria said, her face aflame. "Maria, I had to. You see, he burst in upon us in such an astounding way, Dick did, last evening. Preston and I were sitting together, and in he came, and from his incoherent way of talking, and bringing in your name, he actually startled me. I had to take him alone and find out what was the matter, and then I was afraid Preston would think strangely of it all, and I told him. Maria, why do you care? I tell you an honest heart is not an insult, however impossible it may be to have anything to do with it." "Of course not," Maria said, But then, pshaw, what a perfectly idiotic performance from beginning to end!" And she jerked open the damper and poked her clothes in the boiler with a spiteful air. "What are you boiling clothes for at this time of day? Maria, I wish you would give up that thing. It seems as if you might do so much to gratify me." "I'm doing so much to keep you and your wife from the poorhouse," Maria said with energy. "If you go on in as philanthropic a manner in the future as you have in the past, you will certainly have to depend on me for support. Remember, I heard what your last year's income was." "Well," said Tom, flushing and laughing, "I can live on it. I shall not run in debt. And as for my wife, I don't think you have ever heard her complain. Why are you working so late?" "Because I didn't work early. I was worried and vexed and bewildered. I am sick of plans, anyway. I had a good many for that silly boy, and there he has gone and spilled them all in the most senseless manner. Tom, help me off with this boiler. I'm going to get these clothes hung out before tea. They will dry between this and 10 o'clock. "Do you lift that great boiler alone when I am not here? Maria, I dislike this plan of yours above all things. I could wish that this would be the last boiler full of clothes you would ever touch." "Well, it won't be. I expect to touch hundreds of them, and make my fortune, and yours too, as I said." "Wait a minute," Tom said, with his hand on the boiler. "The doorbell rang. I will see who it is. Perhaps you will need to let the creatures boil away for a while you attend to callers." And he went to the door. "I'll do nothing of the kind," muttered Maria. "I can lift the boiler myself. I've done it 100 times, and you can entertain the callers." It was one of those little, commonplace things that are happening around us every day. 100 times she had lifted that boiler in safety. But the 101st time she staggered under it. Her unsteady foot hit against a block of wood that she herself dropped there but a moment before, and down she went. A slight fall, just on the smooth floor, and by some miraculous intervention the boiler remained right side up with its scalding contents. It all took place in a minute of time, and Tom was back in the kitchen, beholding with dumbfounded face the scene before him. "Lift me," said Maria, "instead of the boiler. I can't stir. I've hurt my back a little. Just open father's room and help me in there. I shall have to lie down for a while. And then set that horrid boiler back on the stove as you planned. I believe it was the wicked spirit in you that made all this happen. Oh, I'm not killed. I shall be up in an hour and rinse those clothes out." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Facing Results. She didn't come out and finish those clothes. What a strange look into the future it would have been if, as Tom carried her in his arms to their father's room, and she gave a swift look back to see if the damper was open or shut, she could have seen the hours that would intervene before she looked around that room again. What was not permitted to her is given now to you, her friends. To have a look at the present future without living over the waste of days that lies between. It is a summer day, in all the perfection of beauty that sentence sometimes implies. Maria Randolph sits in the little sitting-room in the armchair, her hair combed smoothly back and coiled in a not ungraceful twist. Her dress is a wrapper of flowing white. A spray of lilies of the valley is pinned at her throat, and her hands, lying idly in her lap, are almost as white as the dress on which they lie. There is still an invalid in the Randolph household. The pretty house and all its neat and pretty appointments look much the same as they did on that day when Maria left them and was carried into the invalid bedroom. And yet there are changes in many things. A toy cart, with one wheel off, lies against the fence in the yard. A one-armed doll is sleeping on the center table, and a doll's cradle occupies the niche between the two doors. There is an air of quiet bustle about the house. The very chairs wear a look of expectancy. The only perfectly reposeful figure of the room is Maria herself as she leans back in the chair. Exactly 5 years and 17 days has Maria sat in that chair and quietly watched the flow of life go on about her. That step from the stove to the outer door, tugging at the boiler, was the last step that she took. What if she had known it? How utterly it would have crushed her! Now, looking back and knowing it, she smiles a quiet, hushed smile, a smile that rests you to see, and tells you in an instant of time that what life, busy life, and work, and care, and responsibility failed to bring to Maria Randolph, the quiet and pain of a sick room have wrought. This is a gala day in the household, a family reunion, actually the first they have had since the spirit of change fluttered down upon them. Helen is at home, and her husband and her child. The broken cart and armless doll belong to him. Helen is serene in a dress of not quite the right shade of gray to suit her complexion best. "Mr. Leonard bought it," she says, laughing, "and I was not going to tell him it would make me look peach color, for, after all, what difference does it make?" It was not as perfect a fit as Helen Munro always used to wear, but that too is explainable. "It is a trifle loose, and cut a little too low on the shoulders," Helen says. "A young girl made it who is just beginning. The poor thing has to support herself and her mother. I wanted to give her work if I possibly could, and it does very well." Maria listens and smiles, and says to herself, "How different she is, and she doesn't know it. That is the queerest of all." And in that she only smiles and says nothing, keeping all her thoughts within herself, you see how Maria Randolph has changed. And she doesn't know it, but everyone else does. Mr. Randolph comes and goes with brisk business air. He is not a clerk. The neat and tasteful and thriving store is his own, and free from debt, by the last handsome Christmas gift of the rich son-in-law. Moreover, he is well. New York and the White Mountains, and the rest from caretaking helplessness, a looker-on at life's burdens, and not a helper, rest from that heaviest lot of mortal, have lifted the wrinkles from his white face and made him young again. There is a housekeeper flitting in and out, busy and bright and serene. Is her face familiar? It is Maria's one friend, Maggie, or rather Mrs. Reeder. When Maria laid down the burden of the household, Maggie promptly lifted it. It took but a very few hours for Maria to discover that there was ample chance for the kindness she had shown her friend to be repaid. Mr. Reeder is the superintendent at the Randolph house, and the boy is superintendent of them all. Maggie flutters here and there, the air of expectancy on her face, as well as on the house. There is a new building in the backyard, long and low, from whose chimney the smoke constantly issues. Can you guess that it is a washroom, and that all the appliances for carrying on Maria's chosen profession in the most approved style are there? That is Maria's pet. She watches the work from her window, day after day. A dozen girls hard at work there, girls who have been forlorn wanderers in search of employment. Under Maggie's skillful training they do good work, they earn high wages. They are bright and neat and happy. And Maria, well, sitting there in her chair, taking not a step from one year's end to another, her scheme is more clearly being realized than that of many. She is actually growing rich. There is money in it, she had said emphatically, and with Maggie's efficient help she proves it even now. The door of the little sitting room pushes open, and a yellow head bobs in, and says this one sentence: "Auntie Ree, they've come." The head pops out again, and the door closes, and Maria, hearing the bustle, and the eager voices, and the laughter, sits still and waits. There is a wonderful homecoming. Grace is getting back to the early home for the first time since that morning when she went out so tearfully, 5 years ago. Just for the winter, you know. And yet it is true that 5 winters have come and gone since she went away. 5 years since Maria had seen that young sister who used to be her charge and her care. Nobody intended that it should be so long. Everybody would have been shocked if they had imagined it. It was one of those plans which shape themselves, or appear to, without intention on our part. First, there was the White Mountain scheme, where she went with her father, and where his health began to come back to him. Back to New York late, just in time for the opening of the school. A little overwork and a heavy cold keeping her from her plan of a homecoming during the winter vacation. A sudden and alarming sickness on Ermina's part in the spring, and a rush off to the seaside for the summer. A summer of anxious watching, when there was not a day in which to leave Ermina and peep in on the helpless sister at home. Then school and the whirl of coming graduation to occupy time and brain during another winter. No need to take time for running home during the short winter vacation, since she was going in the spring to stay. But what did the spring do but to arrange business matters with the mercantile house that suddenly, with but 24 hours' notice, the junior partner had to be off for Europe. Of course he took his wife. The junior partner was one of those men who always took his wife. And of course so grand an opportunity for Grace to go abroad could not be lost, if it did defer the long-promised going home. And once in Europe, who can tell the numberless schemes and plans that constantly arose to keep them there? The brief history is, that instead of staying 3 months as they had planned, it was a trifle over 2 years before they landed in New York again. Now at last they had come home. And there Maria sat with folded hands, and waited, hearing the sound of the voice in the hall that was familiar, and yet not familiar. There was a certain indefinable change to it that made it remind one of flowers and music. One couldn't tell why. Maria waited with the color deepening on her cheeks, until presently the door opened, and a vision appeared therein. Both sisters looked eagerly at each other. Both spoke at once. "Gracie! Oh, Maria!" Each voice expressed intense surprise. Of course Maria had known that 5 years bring changes, especially when they come in at that period of life when the girl is changing into the woman. She knew that Grace must be developed in form and matured in manner, and yet so to know a fact is one thing, and to realize it is another. Maria had not realized in the least that the fair-faced, shrinking Grace was utterly gone from them, and that in her place would come a brilliant woman. Grace, on her part, had known that Maria was an invalid and helpless, and yet she had imagined her always as bustling eagerly about, accomplishing the work of two, even as she had always known her. To see Maria quiet and thin, and, now that the flush was passing, pale, was a startling surprise. Seeing is so different from hearing. They had all been together for some hours, and had broken bread together at the home tea-table, before anything like a settled feeling began to come to them. There were callers expected for the evening, and presently one and another went their various ways to make ready for the evening, all but Maria, who could not go, and who was always ready, and Mr. Harper, who, being a gentleman, had no toilet to make. He came over to Maria's side as the door closed on the last departure. "What do you think of our experiment?" he asked. "I saw your eyes follow Grace. Has she changed?" "Changed?" repeated Maria. Then she said, "Oh, Mr. Harper, think of Alfred Parks in connection with her now! What is to be the end of it all? Do you know he boasts of his connection with her? I heard only this week of his saying that his lady was just home from Europe." Mr. Harper shook his head, and his voice was sad. "I don't know what the end is to be. I hoped that long before this it would die a natural death. But Grace was more of a woman than I gave her credit for being. She still clings to her ideal friend. Whether she will give it up when she finds that it is nothing but an ideal friendship is a question which gives me anxious thought. In any case, it will be a pain and mortification to her. People cannot play at hearts, Maria, without being injured." "But you say that Grace was not playing, that she clings to it yet." "I know. Yes, she clings to her imagination somewhat, and to her promise a great deal. But if the promise had never been made, as it ought not to have been at her age, this trouble would all be avoided. As it is, I am sure I don't know what the end will be. Perhaps he has improved. At least we shall have a chance to see. He will be in this evening." "Who else is coming this evening? Who came up from New York with you? Gracie spoke of your party." "Why, Dr. Preston came up, and several other New York friends, and stopped at the Randolph house." "Dr. Preston! I haven't seen him since the day I was hurt. Oh, that reminds me. What has become of poor Dick Norton? Did you ever hear Dr. Preston mention him?" "Often. He has been in New York all the time. Why, he came up to-day." "Did he really? How much I should like to see the poor fellow again. Will he come to see us, do you think?" "I should think there would be no doubt of it," Mr. Harper said, and his eyes had a mysterious twinkle. The talk was interrupted by a caller, no less a person than Alfred Parks himself. I wish I could take his photograph for you as he sat there making talk with Mr. Harper and Maria, while he waited for the coming of his early friend. The 5 years had wrought changes in him also. He had grown fleshly, and his nose had reddened suspiciously, so had his eyes. His dress, which was evidently arranged with great care, and with an eye to details, was what those given to the use of slang phrases are wont to denominate flashy. His necktie was rainbow-hued, and there was an uncomfortable commingling of liquor and cigar smoke, hair oil and cologne about him, while the ring on his little finger was far too large and flashing to be other than washed gold and paste diamonds. Altogether, Mr. Harper surveyed him with a sinking heart, and tried to conceal the dismay which he felt from appearing too much in his manner. As for Maria, something of the old indignation throbbed about her as she watched him and tried to imagine him as the lifelong companion of Grace. He, on his part, was entirely at his ease and insufferably familiar. The time seemed to him to have come for being received into familiar relations, and he said Maria and Harper without the least show of embarrassment, notwithstanding the fact that Maria put unusual emphasis on the word Mr. whenever she addressed her brother, and he became suddenly very careful when he spoke to her to say Miss Randolph. Suddenly the young man paused in the midst of a sentence and stared toward the door as one bewildered. Maria turned quickly. Grace was coming down the room. "What is there about a lady's dress when it can neither be called showy nor extremely expensive, and yet marks her as the perfect lady? Verily this question of dress is a strange study. I have a friend who has an artist eye for effect, and who delights in seeing rare combinations of taste. Her dress," he said, speaking of a friend whom he admired, "her dress was simply perfect." "What was it," I ventured, "as to texture and color? People like to be perfect, you know. Why should I not learn what constituted perfect dress in the eyes of this fastidious gentleman?" "What was it? Something soft and clinging and noiseless." What a definite description! I ventured again. "What was the color?" "Subdued, some of those soft, quiet colors blending together, reminding one of sunset and peace." "I dare say. But what were the colors, and what is the material called when one goes shopping?" "Ah, what indeed? I'm sure I don't know. I simply know that the effect was perfect. What matters it what things are, so long as the right effects are produced by them?" Now this is my description of Grace Randolph's dress, and without knowing what was the matter with him, it had a strange effect on Alfred Parks. It embarrassed him. There seemed suddenly to come upon him a sense of incongruity, as if the elements in his appearance and hers did not assimilate. It made the contrast in their manner all the more striking. It was a horribly embarrassing moment. Neither of them acted as they had planned. There was a glow on Grace's cheek that deepened as she came forward. All these years she had clung to the ideal that she had fashioned in her heart when she gave it the name of Alfred Parks, nursing it with patient zeal whenever it seemed to be fading, and now that she stood again before the original, lo, she did not know it. Was this ill-dressed, ill-smelling, ill-mannered man the one with whom she had been corresponding, of whom she had been thinking during the maturing years of her girlhood? Not that she put it in that language. There was simply a rush of dismayed feeling, a sudden heavy sinking of her heart, a sensation as if the world was sinking away into chaos again. Then she rallied, and though every vestige of color left her face, and her voice faltered over the name, she spoke it simply and sweetly. "Alfred." But he on his part did the only thing for which Maria ever gave him any credit. He did not offer to take the proffered hand, and the familiar greeting which he had eagerly planned, that should show her proud relatives on what footing he stood with her, fled from his memory. He managed to stammer out, "How do you do, Miss Randolph?" and that was all. And then Grace took the chair that Mr. Harper brought for her, and through a painful half-hour they tried to converse. What had they talked about during those early days in which they had spent long evenings together? I doubt if either of them knew, but it was only too apparent that they had not a thought in common now. Art, history, travel, music, pictures, science, religion, Alfred Park's brain seemed equally barren of an idea about any of them, and the absurd blunders that he made in his attempt to express his views were not amusing to the little company who had to hear them. They were simply and painfully humiliating. Not one of them but would have tried earnestly to make the fellow at ease, had he been an accidental caller. But with the spell upon them all, that he had actually for 5 years been living in the belief that he was almost a member of the family, they seemed powerless to help him. The color did not return to Grace's cheeks. She looked as if the weight of a dozen added years had suddenly fallen upon her, and Mr. Harper at least grew silent in his sympathy for her pain. It was evidently a rude awakening. His plan, after all, had not worked so well as he had hoped. "It cannot be done," he said to himself. "It cannot be done at all. Where these solemn matters of lifelong vows are played with while people are still children, and do not know their own minds nor their own powers, it will leave its scar. I see plainly that it cannot be helped. Grace can never marry him. It would be a horrible mockery. But then there must be broken promises and humiliating explanations, and the memory all her life of loving words and titles which did not belong to him and should never have been given. It is a miserable business. I wonder when the world will learn that promises are solemn things, and that living is serious business, and that when we are young we are not called upon to decide questions which belong to mature judgments. I wish I saw the way plain through the rest of this." And he looked pitifully at Grace, who was struggling to continue the conversation with Alfred, a conversation which he continually marred by coarse, slang phrases that sounded to her unaccustomed ears even coarser than they really were. And yet she was this man's promised wife. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Randolphs by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. The Last of the Randolphs. The embarrassment did not lessen as the evening waned. On the contrary, when Tom and Dr. Preston came, and the 3 gentlemen tried to converse with Alfred, the difference in culture and refinement of thought and feeling, and above all in purity of language and high moral tone, was even more painfully marked than before. Grace stood her ground bravely, and beyond the pallor of her face and the occasional half-nervous, half-timid appeals that her eyes made to Dr. Preston, she showed nothing of her feelings. Dr. Preston seemed to appreciate the appealing look. He tried patiently to draw the attention away from Alfred, and to interest the party in talk that would require only silence on the part of that young man. But Mr. Harper chose to be merciless. He kept up a steady fire of questions, so direct as to require from Alfred at least an attempt at answering, and as his embarrassment grew upon him, his blunders became more frequent and glaring, until Dr. Preston darted an angry glance at Mr. Harper, and seemed to feel that the misery had been carried far enough. Maria, looking on, studied the situation, and began to comprehend that it was more complicated even than she had feared. There was no mistaking the anxious light in Dr. Preston's eyes, and the patient, manly way in which he tried to shield Grace from pain. Besides, the grateful and pleading glances which she seemed almost unaware that she gave him, told their pitiful story. "It is all confusion," said Maria within her heart, leaning wearily back on the pillow which was always at her back. "How glad I am that the responsibility of working it out, and making the right and wise answer, doesn't rest with me." Something of this thought she expressed in low tones to Mr. Harper, when at last he gave up the effort to draw out the guest, and retired to Maria's corner, while he allowed Tom and Dr. Preston to make the conversation general. He looked down at her, smiling quietly. "And yet you are the young lady who once courted and coveted responsibility, and bore your part in life's tangle remarkably well." Maria smiled back. "That was before I had an idea that I was not responsible at all, at least in the sense in which I used to put it. I thought that all the plans and successes of this family, at least, hung in my hands; and I worked so hard to prove it, not only to myself but others, that you see it was necessary to take all work and influence and power of every sort away from me before I could be made to believe that the world would move on without me. How I fought over my lesson!" "And have only half learned it yet, I should say, if you have ignored all responsibility. Did you ever accomplish so much in the full possession of your powers as you have since you sat here? Don't you know that you have responsibilities resting upon you now of 3 times the importance of those from which you were put aside?" She looked up at him with her clear, full gray eyes. "No," she said quietly, "it is blessed not to have to agree with you. My feeling is utterly different. Work I have done, results have been shown to me, but the responsibility I have forever laid aside. I do now what my Master gives me. Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. Don't you remember how hard I tried to adopt that motto before I understood the first letter of it? It is my motto now and for all the rest of my life. Unquestioning obedience, just so far as the doing goes, but so far as the results are concerned, I think I have no business at all with any of them. Mine is the doing when he says the word, but his is the bringing to pass. And that, you see, is the end of all worrying and planning and doubt. There is no rest nor comfort outside of that conclusion." "You are right," he said, looking down at her with respectful eyes. "You have learned in your quiet chair the lesson that we out in the world at work find it awfully hard to realize, therefore much of the worrying and doubting is still my portion." Whereupon he looked toward Grace and sighed. "Doesn't that really worry you in the least?" he asked. "Don't you think Grace is the Lord's very own?" she asked him. "Aye, I do indeed, with all my soul." "Do you think when he said, 'All things work together for good to them that love God,' that he meant it?" "Yes," he said after a moment's thoughtful silence. "I think I have unquestioning faith in the truth that even our mistakes he will overrule for our good. But, because of that, should we not be sorry for the mistakes of our lives that made rough leading necessary?" "I think we should, and are. But are being sorry and worrying synonymous terms? Cannot I be sorry for the innumerable blunders of my headstrong girlhood, and yet rejoice, and even rest, in the thought that the Lord has forgiven, and will lead?" "Then you think that with regard to Gracie we may rest?" "Why, if the past blunders are to work together for good, should that not rest us? Those are not my words, you know." "Your armchair has been a good teacher," he said, smiling. Then suddenly, as though the words had in some way grown out of the conversation, he added, "Tell me about your boys. Do they come to you every Monday now?" Maria's eyes brightened. "Yes," she said, "and I am doing them good. I know I am. And, but for my blundering with poor Dick Norton, I should never have thought of it. Mr. Harper, do you know Dick? Has his life been a very forlorn one?" "Yes," said Mr. Harper, "I know Dick. Thomson, I thought Norton was coming over with you this evening?" "I was to call for him at 8:30, said Tom, glancing at his watch, "and it is nearly that now. Maria, do you feel able to see him this evening?" And then he went at once to bring him. Maria, relieved by her invalidism from the necessity for talking unless she chose to do so, leaned back among her cushions and watched the play of feeling on the faces before her, and went back over the histories of each life and took in the changes. Ermina had not grown old. Her face had the bright, fresh look of one whose life had never lost its bloom. Neither care nor trouble had come to age her, and strong, healthy work for human hearts had kept her fresh and vigorous. Helen's face had softened. All the lines were clear and tender. The worn look, the lines of impatient martyrdom, had passed away. In their place had come a vivid, glowing interest in life and in work, and a healthy certainty of feeling that Mr. Leonard and his views and plans and ways of work were infinitely superior to all others. He was the same strong-souled, vigorous man who had come for her 5 years before, and the boy was a match for them both. In Grace the change was more striking and startling than in any of the others, and, sitting beside Alfred, the contrast showed more vividly still that he too had changed, had grown coarser in feature and grosser in mind. What grand men they were, those others! And how like a pygmy he appeared by the side of them! It was not a pleasant subject, and she was willing to turn from it to meet Tom and her old friend Dick Norton. Time, and the many changes in herself, had removed all feeling of vexation at the folly of his youth, and she found herself eager to meet her old scholar again. She made the mistake common to many people of forgetting that the 5 years had left their stamp upon him also. And, without realizing it, whenever she thought of him, she called up his image exactly as it had appeared to her the last time she saw him, tall, somewhat overgrown in fact, with a shock of wiry hair that would never lie where its owner desired, and with his ungainly figure arrayed in coarse and ill-fitting and ill-chosen garments. "What a contrast he will present to them all!" she said, glancing at the others. "And yet he will be an improvement on that poor attempt at gentility." She added this with a sort of pitying contempt. Then she turned to greet her old friend. "Maria," Tom said, "this is your old acquaintance, Dr. Norton." And Maria neither answered nor gave her hand in greeting. She simply stared. Dr. Norton! Who on earth could he be? Not certainly any one who had ever been known to her. This man was tall, finely formed, and finely dressed. That is, his dress was of the quiet kind which cannot be described, but which makes you instantly think of a gentleman. Moreover, his bow was easy and graceful, and his voice, as he said, "Will you shake hands with an old acquaintance, Miss Randolph?" was smooth and cultured. "You are not Dick," stammered forth Maria at last, the flush on her cheek deepening, and her bewilderment rapidly becoming an embarrassment. "I am indeed the veritable Dick, though I have worked hard for the title, behind which your brother has hidden me. Don't you remember me at all, Miss Randolph?" And then they shook hands, and Tom, seeing his sister's confusion, hurried his friend away to meet the other members of the circle. Maria listened as one in a maze to the talk that followed. Changes! Why, none of them had so utterly bewildered her, nor seemed so impossible to understand. She watched the newcomer as he took his place in the circle with an assured air of one who was accustomed to the society of those who greeted him as their equal. She listened to the animated talk in which, owing to the fact that it fell upon some subject which he had lately examined, he took the greater share. And as she listened, the strangeness did not diminish, though certain touches of tone and a sort of intensity of manner began to remind her of the Dick Norton that she had known, in the days that seemed suddenly to have receded into the very distant past. Tom came over to her for a bit of confidential talk. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said reproachfully. "I was never so amazed in my life. They gave me a strange feeling, all these changes, as if I had suddenly lost my identity, and this were a new world, where the shadows of the people whom I used to know were gathering around me." "What a ghostly scene it must be," Tom said gaily. Then he proceeded to answering her question. "Well, there are two reasons for my not talking of Dick to you. In the first place, I find that I had not the remotest idea that there had been such a development as there has. I knew he was studying medicine. In fact, I knew that Dr. Preston went away with that idea in his mind. But for a long time I regarded it as a freak of his, and a very unwise one. I thought nothing would come of it but disappointment for them both. Afterward, when I heard that Dick had become an indefatigable student, and that Dr. Preston believed that he was destined to distinguish himself in medicine, I thought it would be such a pleasant surprise to you that I would wait and give time a chance to do its work. But, mind you, I hadn't an idea that she worked so rapidly. I expected to see him improved, but nothing at all like this. He has actually graduated and commenced practice with Dr. Preston, and the doctor tells me that he is certainly destined to a brilliant career. Looking at him now, it isn't hard to credit the prophecy. Maria, the best of it all is that he says he owes it all to you, that he would to this day have been nothing but a streetcar driver, earning his daily wages, but for your helping hand." "That is nonsense," Maria said, with a trace of her old vehemence of manner. "It was his forlorn reachings after a better place in the world that first suggested to me to help him." "No," said her brother quietly. "You forget that you helped him about those shirts before he ever dreamed of such a thing as an aspiration. That shirt business was the most sublime reach that your genius ever took, Maria. Not a day passes but I hear of some fruit." Maria was laughing. It was a novel subject to call sublime, and it had its ludicrous side. But there were tears in her eyes. The fruit was certainly beyond anything that she had dreamed. "Is he a Christian man?" she asked suddenly. "Aye, that he is, a grand one, Preston says, doing a splendid work in the city, and his headquarters are at the streetcar stations, among the drivers and hostlers. Preston says not a man of them but knows him and would give their lives to serve him. Think of that! Don't you see how you are working while you sit here?" At this point the young doctor abruptly drew his chair away from Mr. Leonard, with whom he had been talking, and came over to Maria's side. "Will you tell me just what the different stages of your sickness have been?" "What a formidable question to put to a girl who has been sick for 5 years!" she said, with a serio-comic look at the earnest face. But he was evidently very much in earnest. He began a rapid fire of questions, clear, penetrating, and intensely professional. Dr. Preston evidently caught the sound of familiar professional words, and came over to their side of the room, stationing himself behind Tom's chair, and listening intently. At last the new doctor paused and looked up at him. "Well, sir," said Dr. Preston, "what do you think?" "I think that electrical treatment will restore her." Maria turned suddenly and looked up in Dr. Preston's face, the sudden paling of her own revealing the keen eagerness of her desire to be in and of the world again, instead of being shut up within the 2 arms of her easy-chair. Dr. Preston was a name well known in the medical world. He was one whose judgment was almost proof against mistakes, and if he did other than smile on this young enthusiast, if he even treated the sentence with a show of gravity, as though there might be something in it, why then, indeed, she might almost begin to hope. Tom, too, had turned and was waiting for his answer. He did not keep them waiting. His voice was quick and firm. "I have been thinking of the same thing. I have been listening with keen interest to your examination. I am almost sure you are right." It would be difficult to describe the state of eager excitement into which this simple sentence threw the circle. They had ceased their conversation, and were listening. As a family they were all in eager sympathy with his answer. They gathered around Maria, and were so voluble in their exclamations of delight and of hopefulness, that Dr. Norton, who had the air of one who had been called as a professional adviser, and therefore had the care of the patient, peremptorily advised them not to excite themselves and weary her, but to wait and see. At this opportune moment Alfred Parks seemed to have determined that he had endured as long as he could the strain upon his nerves, and arose to leave. It was a somewhat embarrassing moment. Tom did not choose to act the part of host, and Mr. Randolph had not yet arrived. Mr. Harper half arose as one accustomed to act in his sister's stead, and then sat down again as Grace resolutely turned toward the hall door as if to accompany her guest. Dr. Preston turned promptly toward them. "By the way, Mr. Parks," he said, "did I hear you speaking of young Wheeler? Where is he now?" And as he spoke he threw open the hall door. A sudden and marked interest in young Wheeler seemed to have come to him, for he continued his questions, following Alfred and Grace into the hall in the most natural manner possible, and keeping the former engaged in answering while he selected his hat. It was finally Dr. Preston who drew back the night latch, and opened the door for him, and bowed him from the steps. Utter silence filled the hall while Grace waited, and he closed the door. Then he said, "Gracie, are broken promises worse than false vows?" "Oh, doctor," she answered, while her cheeks glowed and her eyes burned painfully, "it is all a bitter humiliation." "I know," he said, "but take care. Do not make it worse by adding false vows. Remember that. Remember that no early mistake can be righted by adding to it a later and a graver one." Then they went back to the sitting room. I do not know that you are as interested in all these people as I am. Probably you are not. It is one thing to live lives right along with people, and another to tell about lives after they have been lived. But I really would like to tell you about the weeks and months that followed, about what blessed times this united family had together during the next month, about the vigorous way in which the two doctors entered upon the new treatment that was to do so much for Maria, about the number of times it became necessary for the young doctor to come up from New York to be sure that his directions were being carried out, and that the longed-for effects were being produced, about the new plans that were being developed for the Randolph house, so that they reached out far beyond the first hopes or even thoughts of the early days of the enterprise, plans in which our old friend, Peter Armstrong, took such an eager and practical interest that the rest said of him, laughingly, that the mantle of his namesake, Peter Bible, must surely have fallen upon him, such was the vim and zeal that he threw into the work. "If I should lose him," Tom said, looking after him one night, as, after having given a brief, rapid account of the day's grand results in the reaching out after tempted men, he rushed away to fresh work, "if I should lose him, I am afraid I should give up the enterprise in awful grief and dismay. He is the most indefatigable fisher I ever met. Blessed be the day when his heart took in those words, 'I will make you fishers of men.' They will be the keynote to his life." Of all these things I have neither time nor space to tell you. I must just take you over months of time, down to a winter evening when there was a jubilee at the Randolph house, not the newly fitted-up hotel, but the family home. They were all gathered at the homestead, Helen unexpectedly back again from her Western home, because everybody must come home to weddings. The wedding had been, and the bridal pair were about starting on their journey. Of course you know it was Grace, and of course you know that the bridegroom was not Alfred Parks. That folly of her girlhood had to be atoned for as best she could, and, at the best, it left sore spots and a feeling of pain and shame at the thought, but the bridegroom was Dr. Preston. It was well that he was so good and so great and so patient a man. Few would have borne with the folly of her early days with the spirit he had shown. It was a discomfort, a pain, to feel that such a man had been defrauded of many a tender word and touch that should have been his own, and that were wasted before the bride was old enough to feel their sacredness. but it had righted itself at last, as well at least as mistakes ever right themselves, and now they lingered about that side piazza door, looking wistfully after the carriage that bore away the youngest born. Mr. Randolph walked to the end of the piazza, and stood in the darkness and silence for a little. Then he walked back, and said to Maria in a husky voice, "It is hard to give up mother's baby." That little mother was the name still that brought the tears to the fading eyes of this gray-haired man. Yes, he said this to Maria. She stood beside him in the doorway. It is a wonderful thing to stand in a doorway when you are doing it for the first time in 6 years. The new doctor's positiveness had been founded on wisdom. The dear dream was realized, and she could walk. "Not too long," an anxious voice said just behind her. "My dear Maria, I don't want you to stand long at a time, not yet a while. Wait a little, and you will be able to stand as long as you want, and to walk where you choose." "This is the first time I have been in the kitchen, you know," she said, turning smiling eyes on familiar yet unfamiliar objects. "I don't suppose you have any idea of how strange it all seems to me. Dick, I stood just there when that horrid boiler tipped over with me." It was a strange place for sentiment, that winter kitchen, with the coffee boiler steaming on the stove, and the remains of the wedding feast strewn everywhere. But they stood there for a long time, despite the caution, and went over many an old time that the familiar furnishings of that room brought back to them. "I must go now," Dr. Dick Norton said, as he looked at his watch. "It will not do not to be in New York early in the morning. I shall have double duty now until Dr. Preston returns. Well, Maria, I shall be down by New Year's, and by that time I have strong hope that you can travel in safety." A moment afterward he went with a brisk step down the walk. Maria stood looking after him. Before the sound of his footsteps died away, Tom came up the same walk. He had been to look after the departing train that carried away the new bride. "Dick will be late," he said. "I hear the train whistling." Maria made no answer. Her brother paused in the cheery little winter kitchen, and looked at her searchingly. Then he reached forth his hand after hers. "The last of the Randolphs?" he said, inquiringly. "Don't, Tom," she said, laughing, though there were tears in her eyes. "You don't intend to commit suicide, do you? I am sure you are a Randolph." "But you intend to take care of Dick's buttons for the rest of your days? Is that so? I was sure of it. Well, let me see. Didn't you once tell me that Dick was the first fruit of your first attempt to follow out the teachings of your whatsoever? It was the golden rule, too, wasn't it? How grand it is that you taught him to follow its teachings also. Maria, the story of the leadings of the Randolph family would make a book, wouldn't it?" And you see, dear friends, it has. End of Chapter 29. End of The Randolphs, by Pansy. Thanks for listening.